Eleanor Whitmore slammed a manila folder onto Madeline's kitchen table so hard the coffee cups rattled. Inside was a single ultrasound photo, twin heartbeats, and a smile on Eleanor's face that Madeline would never forget. 7 years, Eleanor said, her voice cold as marble. 7 years you gave my son nothing. Vivian is carrying the future of this family. You are simply in the way. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people who were supposed to love you, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe to our channel, follow Madeline's story, and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Madeline Harper had learned a long time ago that certain rooms in certain houses were designed to make you feel small. The Whitmore mansion had many such rooms. There was the formal dining room with its 16-foot ceilings and crystal chandelier that cast cold, white light over everything sitting beneath it. There was the sitting room with its antique furniture arranged so precisely that you were afraid to move, afraid to breathe too deeply, afraid that the very act of existing in that space might disturb something that had been perfectly curated before you ever arrived. And then there was the kitchen. The kitchen was supposed to be the warm room, the human room, the room where walls came down and people stopped performing and simply existed together. That was what kitchens were supposed to be. But in the Whitmore house, even the kitchen felt like a courtroom. Madeline was standing at the counter when she heard the front door open. She was not expecting company. Julian, her husband, was at the office. Their housekeeper, Rosa, had left an hour earlier. The house was supposed to be hers for the afternoon. Just hers, just quiet, just the soft October light falling through the tall windows and the smell of the tea she had made for herself. She heard heels on the marble floor, precise, deliberate, the kind of steps that announced themselves. She turned around and Eleanor Whitmore walked into the kitchen like she owned it, which in a certain legal sense, she did not, but in every other sense, Eleanor had always walked through this house like it belonged to her. Behind her was a woman Madeline recognized immediately. Vivian Blake, Julian's executive assistant. Vivian was 28 years old, and she carried herself the way beautiful women sometimes do when they have learned that beauty is currency, and they have spent years learning exactly how to spend it. She was wearing a dress that Madeline did not recognize, a deep emerald wrap dress that fell below the knee, and it took Madeline exactly 3 seconds to understand why the dress was cut the way it was cut. Vivian was pregnant, not a little pregnant, not the early, uncertain kind of pregnant that you could mistake for something else. Vivian was visibly, undeniably, obviously pregnant. Madeline felt the floor shift beneath her feet, not literally. She did not stumble. She did not drop her mug. She stood perfectly still, the way she had trained herself to stand perfectly still whenever something terrible was happening, because she had learned early in her marriage to the Whitmore family that showing emotion was the same as handing someone a weapon. Eleanor placed a folder on the kitchen table. She did not say hello. She did not apologize for entering without calling. She simply placed the folder on the table and said, "Sit down, Madeline." Madeline looked at the folder. Then she looked at Vivian. Then she looked at Eleanor. "I'll stand," she said. Something flickered behind Eleanor's eyes. Annoyance, maybe. Or surprise. Eleanor was not accustomed to people declining her instructions. "Suit yourself," Eleanor said, and opened the folder herself. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, grainy in the way that ultrasound images are grainy. Those small, mysterious shapes floating in a dark field that only trained eyes can read clearly. But Madeline could read it clearly enough. 2 shapes. 2 distinct, unmistakable shapes. Twins. Vivian is 14 weeks along, Eleanor said. A boy and a girl. The Whitmore family has always wanted an heir. Julian has always wanted children. Madeline said nothing. "We had a DNA test done at 12 weeks, Eleanor continued, her voice perfectly level the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis. "Julian is the father." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the street. A door closed somewhere in the neighborhood. The refrigerator hummed. These were the small, ordinary sounds of a world that was continuing to exist even as Madeline's collapsed quietly around her. "How long?" Madeline asked. Her voice surprised her. It came out steady, clear. She had not expected that. Eleanor glanced at Vivian. Vivian had the grace, at least, to look at the floor. "Julian and I have been close for almost 3 years, Vivian said quietly. "I never intended for it to happen this way. 3 years. Madeline had been married to Julian for 7 years. That meant that for nearly half of their marriage, her husband had been involved with another woman. For nearly half of the years she had spent cooking dinner and attending board meetings as his plus one and holding his hand through failed acquisitions and sitting beside him in hospital waiting rooms. When his father's heart gave out, he had been with someone else. She did the math in her head the way you do when you're in shock and your brain needs something concrete to hold on to. 3 years, 36 months, more than 1,000 days. I see, Madeline said. We know this is difficult, Eleanor said. And her tone was the tone of a woman who believed exactly the opposite of what she was saying. But the Whitmore family needs to think about the future. Julian needs to think about the future, and the truth is, Madeline, that you have been married to my son for 7 years, and you have given this family nothing. There it was, the word that Eleanor had been building toward from the moment she walked through the door. Nothing, nothing, Madeline repeated softly. No children, Eleanor said. And now her voice had an edge to it, something sharp and deliberate sliding beneath the polished surface. No heirs, no continuation of the Whitmore name. You have spent 7 years in this house, in this family, and you have given us nothing to show for it. Vivian shifted uncomfortably. Even she seemed to understand that something ugly had entered the room. But Eleanor was not finished. Vivian is giving my son what you could not, Eleanor said. A family, heirs, the future that this family deserves. Madeline looked at her mother-in-law. She looked at the woman who had sat across from her at every Thanksgiving dinner for 7 years. The woman who had called her dear in the way some women call you dear when they mean something much colder. The woman who had smiled at her at charity functions and introduced her to business partners and stood beside her in photographs that hung on the walls of this very house. She looked at this woman and she thought about everything she had swallowed over 7 years. Every small slight, every backhanded compliment, every quiet suggestion that she was not quite enough, not quite right, not quite what the Whitmore family had in mind. She thought about the doctor's appointments, the fertility specialists, the blood tests, the procedures that left her tired and sore and sitting in sterile rooms filled with magazines nobody reads. She thought about the treatments she had tried, the hormones that made her cry at nothing, the hope she had rebuilt every month and watched collapse. She thought about how Julian had sat beside her in those waiting rooms, holding her hand, looking concerned, never once telling her the truth. The truth that she had blamed herself for something that was never her fault. Because the truth that Madeline knew and had been carrying for exactly 14 days, was that there was nothing wrong with her fertility at all. She was pregnant, not with 1 baby, not with 2, with 4, quadruplets. Julian Whitmore's 4 children were growing inside her body at this very moment, and not a single person in this kitchen knew it except her. What does Julian want? Madeline asked. Eleanor straightened. Julian understands what the family needs. That's not what I asked. A pause. Julian wants to do right by Vivian and the children she's carrying, Eleanor said carefully. And what about me? You would be taken care of, Eleanor said. Generously, you would not leave this marriage with nothing. Of course not, Madeline said quietly. Vivian spoke then, and her voice was softer than Madeline expected, almost apologetic, though whether the apology was genuine or performative was impossible to know. I never wanted to hurt you, Madeline, I really didn't. But Julian deserves children. He deserves a woman who can build a family with him. The words hung in the air between them. A woman who can build a family with him, as if Madeline were a construction project that had stalled, as if she were an investment that had failed to produce returns. Madeline set her mug down on the counter. She picked up the ultrasound photo from the folder and looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it down. I'd like you both to leave now, she said. Eleanor blinked. Madeline. I'd like you both to leave my house, Madeline said again. And this time there was something in her voice that made even Eleanor Whitmore stop. Not anger, not tears, something much quieter and much more powerful than either. Certainty. Eleanor closed the folder. She picked it up. She looked at Madeline for a moment with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been something approaching respect, though she would never have admitted that. We'll be in touch, Eleanor said. They left. Madeline stood in the kitchen alone. She listened to the heels cross the marble floor. She listened to the front door open and close. She listened to the sound of Eleanor's car starting in the driveway and pulling away. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and she put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had already done her crying. She had done it 2 weeks ago. In a bathroom in a medical office downtown, sitting on a paper-covered examination table, holding a report that said what no one in her life would have expected it to say. She had done it alone, which was how she had done most of the difficult things in her life. Quietly, privately, without an audience, she had cried until she had nothing left. And then she had started thinking. Because Madeline Harper had learned something important in 34 years of living. She had learned that the women who got through the worst things were not the women who fell apart the loudest. They were the women who went quiet, who listened, who thought 3 steps ahead while everyone around them was still reacting to step 1. So she sat at her kitchen table in her expensive house, with her husband's affair and his mother's ultimatum and her own impossible secret, and she thought for a very long time. When Julian came home that evening, she was sitting at the dinner table with 2 plates already set, and 2 glasses of water poured, and a meal she had cooked herself, because cooking was something she did when she needed to feel in control of something. Julian walked through the door and looked at her and knew immediately. She could see it on his face, the way the color shifted slightly, the way his jaw tightened, the way he stopped, just inside the doorway as if he was calculating whether he could turn around and leave. She came, Madeline said. It was not a question. Julian stepped into the room. He was still in his suit, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled in the way it always was by the end of a long day. He looked tired, he looked guilty, he also looked, and this was the part that cut the deepest, slightly relieved, as if he had been dreading this conversation for so long that having it finally arrive was its own kind of release. He sat down across from her. Yes, he said. Why didn't you tell me yourself? Julian looked at his plate. I was trying to figure out the right way to handle it. 3 years. Julian, he looked up. 3 years, Madeline said again. And her voice was perfectly even. That's how long you've been with her. That's what she said. 3 years. Julian opened his mouth. Closed it, opened it again. Things got complicated, he said finally. Those 3 words. Things got complicated. Madeline had imagined this conversation many times in the past 2 weeks, since she'd started to suspect, since she'd found the small evidence that multiplied into something undeniable. She had imagined what he might say. She had imagined dramatic confessions, tearful apologies, elaborate explanations. She had imagined anger and defensiveness and the particular cruelty that frightened men sometimes reach for when they've been caught. She had not imagined those 3 words. Things got complicated. As if the 7 years she had given this man, the years she had stood beside him and supported him and loved him the way she had loved him, completely without reservation, as if all of that had simply gotten caught up in something unavoidable. Like traffic, like weather, like an inconvenient circumstance. I blamed myself, Madeline said quietly. For years, I blamed myself for not being able to give you children. I went to doctors. I took medications. I put my body through things that were painful and degrading. And I blamed myself every single month when it didn't work. And you let me. Julian's jaw worked, Madeline. You let me believe I was the problem, she continued. Still in that same quiet, steady voice that she could feel taking enormous effort to maintain. You sat beside me in those waiting rooms. You held my hand. And you never once told me the truth. The timing was the truth. Julian, her voice cut through his cleanly, not loud, just sharp. You owed me the truth. He was quiet for a long time. I know, he said finally. Is that all you have? Another silence. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything, Madeline said. I want to know what you want to do. Not what your mother wants. Not what Vivian wants. What do you want, Julian? He looked at her across the table and she watched him wrestle with it. She watched him try to find something, some version of the truth that would be easier than the real one. She had known this man for 9 years. She could read the effort on his face. I need to take responsibility for the children Vivian is carrying, he said at last. I see. I'm sorry, Madeline. I know I know it's not enough. No, she agreed. It's not. She stood up and began clearing the plates. Plates that had not been touched. A meal that would not be eaten. My family wants to offer you a settlement, Julian said, to make the transition easier. Transition, Madeline almost laughed. She managed not to. How much? She asked, setting the plates in the sink. We were thinking 20 million. She turned the water on. Let it run, she said. The water ran. Madeline, 20 million is not enough. Then tell me what is, Julian said. And there was frustration creeping into his voice now, the frustration of a man who had expected this to go differently. Who had expected grief or begging or the kind of emotional scene he could make up by simply waiting it out. Madeline turned the water off. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She folded it neatly the way she always folded it, habit being what it is, and she set it on the counter and she turned around. 80 million, she said. The silence was complete. Julian stared at her. You're not serious. I am entirely serious. 80, Madeline? That's 7 years of my life, Julian. That's the fertility treatments I didn't need. That's the self-blame you allowed me to carry. That's the investment I made in this family. In your career, in your home, in your reputation." She kept her voice perfectly calm. "Perfectly level, 80 million, and I will disappear quietly. I will sign whatever paperwork your lawyers prepare. I will leave Chicago and I will not come back. Your family will have exactly what they want." Julian stared at her for a long time. "I'll talk to my mother," he said at last. "You do that." She walked out of the kitchen and left him sitting there alone. Upstairs in their bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her stomach. The gesture was almost unconscious. She had been doing it more and more in the past 2 weeks, this small private acknowledgement of the secret growing inside her. 4 babies, she was carrying 4 lives. Her OB had said it with a kind of stunned professionalism, the way doctors deliver extraordinary news when they've trained themselves not to be surprised, by anything but are surprised anyway. 4 fetuses, Madeline, all with strong heartbeats. Quadruplets are rare, but they happen and all 4 of them look healthy. She had stared at the monitor. 4 small flickering lights, 4 heartbeats. She had made her decision in that moment, sitting in that examination room with those 4 heartbeats on the screen. She had made a decision that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she had ever done, and she was still not entirely certain which one it was. She would not tell Julian, not yet, not until she knew exactly what she was going to do. In the days that followed, the negotiations were brutal in the way that only polite negotiations can be brutal. Everything said with careful language in well-appointed rooms by people in expensive clothing, but brutal nonetheless. Eleanor arrived with her lawyers. Julian's lawyers were there. They went through settlement figures the way you go through items on a checklist, methodically without feeling, as if 7 years of a human life were simply a line item to be resolved. Eleanor had started at 20 million. Madeline had said no. 30 million, no 45 million, no 50 million and a house in Palm Beach. No, what does she want? Eleanor had demanded of Julian in a voice that Madeline could hear from the hallway where she was standing. "She's not being reasonable. She wants 80 million, Julian said. "That's obscene. That's what she wants. She doesn't deserve Mother." Julian's voice had an edge to it that Madeline rarely heard. "You're the one who went to her without talking to me first. You're the one who brought Vivian to her house. This is the situation we're in." A long silence. "Fine," Eleanor said at last, and the word came out like something being torn. "Fine, $80 million, and the condition, Madeline would sign the divorce papers, leave America, never return, and never reveal the truth of what had happened to anyone who mattered." She sat across from Eleanor at the lawyer's table. Eleanor had a look on her face that Madeline knew well, the look of a woman who believed she was getting the better deal even while paying out a fortune. The look of someone who thought that money was the cleanest solution to a messy problem, that once the check cleared, the story would be over. Madeline picked up the pen. She thought about the 4 heartbeats. She thought about what she was doing and why she was doing it. She signed. The lawyers gathered the papers. Eleanor stood. She looked at Madeline with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite guilt, somewhere in between, occupying the uncomfortable middle ground that people sometimes reach when they get what they wanted but can feel the cost of it. "I hope you'll use the money wisely," Eleanor said. Madeline looked at her. "I will," she said simply. That night, alone in a hotel room because she had left the Whitmore house the same day the papers were signed, she sat on the bed with her laptop open and a plane ticket on the screen. Sydney, Australia. She had chosen it not for any particular emotional reason but for practical ones. Far enough, stable economy, good medical system. A city large enough to disappear into and grow into and build something real in. She stared at the ticket for a long time. Then she thought about what Eleanor had said in that kitchen. "Nothing, 7 years, and you gave this family nothing." And she thought about the 4 heartbeats she had seen on that monitor. She booked the ticket. She was 3 months along when she boarded the plane. Not showing yet, not in a way that anyone around her in the airport or on the plane would have noticed. She wore loose clothing and she moved carefully and she kept her hands in her lap during the long flight over the Pacific. Julian had come to the airport. She had not expected that. He was standing near the security line, not blocking her path, just standing there in his coat, looking at her with an expression she could not quite name. Not regret exactly, not grief, something more complicated than either. "You don't have to do this," he said when she reached him. She stopped. She looked at him, this man she had loved for 9 years, this man who had let her suffer through fertility treatments she didn't need, this man who had said things got complicated as if that were an explanation for anything. Yes, I do, she said. Madeline, don't. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him completely. Don't make this about what you need from me right now. Julian, I spent 7 years doing that. I'm done. He looked at her for a long moment. I am sorry, he said. For whatever that's worth, I know you are, she said. She meant it. She believed he was sorry. She believed that the version of Julian Whitmore standing in that airport with his hands in his coat pockets genuinely felt the weight of what he had done. She believed he was experiencing something that felt like grief, like regret, like the specific pain of watching a consequence arrive. But sorry and changed were different things, and she had 4 heartbeats to think about. She picked up her bag. Take care of yourself, Julian, she said. She walked through security without looking back. She had learned, over 7 years and 3,000 miles of hard road, that looking back was the most expensive thing you could do. The flight was 14 hours. She slept through most of it, which surprised her because she had expected her mind to be too loud, too full of everything she was leaving behind. But her body was building 4 lives simultaneously, and it demanded rest with an authority she could not argue with. When she landed in Sydney, it was early morning. The light was different here. Softer somehow, the way light is in cities that face the ocean, diffused and warm and spreading across everything without judgment. She stood at the arrivals gate with 1 suitcase and a carry-on bag and $80 million in a secure account and 4 lives growing inside her, and she breathed in the air of a city that did not know her name. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled for the following morning. She had a rental apartment confirmed on a lease signed digitally from Chicago. She had a plan. She had always had a plan, even in the worst moments, even sitting at that kitchen table with Eleanor's cold voice filling the room. She had been thinking. She had been 3 steps ahead of everyone in that house because she had understood something they hadn't. They thought they were removing her from the story. They thought money and distance and a signed document would make her disappear. Not just geographically, but narratively. They thought she would take the money and become invisible, become a footnote, become the first wife in a story about the beautiful second wife and the twin heirs and the triumphant Whitmore family. They had fundamentally misunderstood who she was. Madeline Harper had never been a woman who disappeared. She had been quiet, yes. Patient, yes. She had chosen her battles carefully, and she had endured things that other women might not have endured because she had a long game in her mind that most people couldn't see because she'd never shown it to them. But she was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply been waiting for the moment when the truth would be more powerful than the silence. That moment was coming. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. The morning after she landed, she sat in a bright, clean medical office in the Darlinghurst neighborhood and watched 4 small shapes move on a monitor, while a doctor who did not know her history spoke with measured excitement about the remarkable health of all 4 fetuses. 2 boys, 2 girls, the doctor said, all measuring right on track. How are you feeling? Strong, Madeline said, and she meant it. She sat in the taxi back to her apartment and she watched Sydney move past the windows. The harbor glimpsed between buildings, the morning joggers and the coffee shops, and the ordinary living of a city going about its ordinary day. She put her hand on her stomach. We're going to be okay, she said softly. All 5 of us. Back in Chicago, the Whitmore family was already planning the wedding. Julian and Vivian, a spring ceremony, 700 guests. The kind of event that got written up in the society pages and photographed for architecture magazines and talked about at dinner parties for the next 2 years. Eleanor was in her element. She had always loved a grand occasion, and she had always believed that the way the world saw your family mattered as much as the truth of who your family was. Maybe more, and so she threw herself into the planning with the energy of a woman who had just solved her biggest problem. The first wife was gone, the future was secured, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Madeline knew all of this because she still had friends in Chicago. Not many, but a few, women who had been quietly kind to her over the years, who texted her occasionally with carefully worded updates that conveyed everything, while saying as little as possible. She did not respond to these texts with anything that could be used against her. She simply read them. She filed the information away. She continued building. She found a business incubator in Sydney that worked with entrepreneurs, and she began developing the design company she had been thinking about for years, the one she had quietly planned during long evenings in Chicago while Julian was working late, and she had been alone in the house with her thoughts. Interior design, but more than that, design as identity. Design as rebuilding. Design for women who were starting over, who needed their spaces to reflect the person they were becoming rather than the person they had been forced to be. She hired 2 people in the first month, then 4, then 7. She was 6 months pregnant and running a company and building a life and growing 4 humans being simultaneously. And she had never in her life felt more fully herself. The checks were in place, the legal documents were in place. And the most important thing of all, the thing that Eleanor Whitmore had never considered, because it had not occurred to Eleanor that a woman she dismissed as nothing might be capable of this kind of thinking. But the evidence was in place. Madeline had spent the weeks before she left Chicago very carefully and very quietly gathering what she needed. Messages, not stolen, not hacked, not obtained illegally. Simply saved. She had access to Julian's shared email account, the one they had set up together years ago for household logistics. And she had been methodical, recordings, legal in the state where they were made. Conversations she had been present for, conversations she had a right to record. Documentation, medical records, financial records. The timeline of events laid out with the precision of a woman who had spent 7 years watching how the Whitmore family operated and had learned their methods by living among them. She had put everything into a secure file, and she had made arrangements for that file to be delivered at a specific moment. Not now, not yet. She had always been patient. The spring wedding of Julian Whitmore and Vivian Blake was scheduled for the 15th of March. 700 guests, the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Group's flagship hotel on Michigan Avenue. A ceremony officiated by a judge who was also an old family friend. A reception that was expected to run until 2 in the morning. Madeline had marked the date on her calendar. By March 15th, her children would be in the world. By March 15th, the DNA tests would be complete. By March 15th, the truth would be a document in an envelope, ready to travel. She pressed her hand against her stomach again. 4 heartbeats. Her greatest secret. Her greatest protection. Her greatest answer to every person who had ever looked at her as in seen nothing. Because here was the thing about nothing. Nothing was the lie people told themselves to make their cruelty easier to live with. Nothing was the story you constructed when the real story was too complicated or too inconvenient or too threatening to your understanding of how things were supposed to work. Madeline Harper had never been nothing. She had been the most important person in that house, in that family, in that story, and they had spent 7 years unable to see it because they had been looking for a certain kind of value, and she had been a different kind altogether. They were about to learn the difference. Outside her Sydney apartment, the harbor was going gold in the late afternoon light. She could hear the sounds of the city, distant and alive and full of possibility. She sat at her desk, and she worked on her business plan, and she listened to the sounds of her new city, and she thought about the spring. She thought about a wedding in Chicago. She thought about a courier. She thought about an envelope. She thought about the look on Julian Whitmore's face when he finally understood what he had thrown away. She smiled, not from cruelty, not from revenge, from the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly what is coming and has the patience to wait for it. Everything was in place. Everything was exactly as it needed to be. All she had to do now was wait, and Madeline Harper had learned, in 7 years and 3,000 miles and 4 impossible heartbeats, that waiting was something she did extraordinarily well. The morning after Madeline signed the divorce papers, she woke up at 5:43 and lay completely still in the dark of her hotel room and listened to the city of Chicago breathe outside the window. She had not slept more than 3 hours, not because she was crying. She had already done her crying. Weeks ago, in a medical office bathroom with 4 heartbeats on a monitor she could not stop staring at. Not because she was angry, though the anger was there, steady and quiet beneath everything else like an underground river. She had not slept because her mind would not stop running calculations. Numbers, timelines, contingencies. The particular insomnia of a woman who has made a very large decision and is now in the process of making sure every single detail of that decision is correct. $80 million. She said it aloud in the dark, quietly just to hear how it sounded. $80 million. It sounded like freedom. It sounded like the future. It also sounded like the price the Whitmore family had put on 7 years of her life, which meant they had valued each year at just under $11.5 million. And she supposed that was what happened when you reduced a human being to a transaction. You did the math and you signed the check and you told yourself it was generous and you went to sleep at night believing that money was the same thing as resolution. Eleanor believed that. Madeline was counting on it. She got up at 6 and made coffee with the small in-room machine and sat at the desk by the window with her laptop open and went through every document one more time. The divorce agreement, the non-disclosure clause, the settlement transfer confirmation. The medical record she had printed and organized into a folder that she had placed inside a padded envelope along with 3 other items. A DNA test request form pre-filled and dated. A letter she had written by hand on plain paper, and a business card for a courier service in Sydney with a delivery instruction attached. She read the letter again. It was not long, it was not dramatic. It did not contain accusations or recriminations, or the kind of language that grief sometimes produces, excessive and raw and difficult to read. It was simply precise, clear, the kind of letter that said exactly what it needed to say in exactly the number of words required to say it. She folded it, she placed it back in the envelope. She sealed the envelope. Then she opened a different document on her laptop and continued working on the thing she had been building quietly for the past 3 weeks, the thing no one in the Whitmore orbit knew existed. Her business plan, her design company, the foundation of the life she was about to construct from scratch on the other side of the world. She worked until 8, then she showered, dressed, called a car and went to the airport. Julian was there. She had not expected that, and she thought later that she should have anticipated it, because Julian had always needed the last word, not out of cruelty but out of the particular weakness of men who cannot tolerate ambiguity, who need closure even when they don't deserve it. He was standing near the security entrance in dark, his hand in his pockets, and he looked like he hadn't slept either. Good, she thought, and then she felt slightly ashamed of thinking it. And then she decided she didn't have time for shame right now. "I didn't know you were coming," she said. "I needed to see you," he said. She stopped walking, but she did not put her bag down. A small signal, intentional. She was not staying. This was not a negotiation. "Julian, you don't have to go to Australia," he said. And his voice had something in it she hadn't heard in a long time. Something raw and unpolished and almost young. "You could go anywhere. New York, Europe, wherever you want. You don't have to go that far." Madeline looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do. I know you're angry. I am not angry." She said it simply, and she meant it. "I am done." "Those are very different things, Julian." He looked at her with an expression she recognized from the early years, the pre-Vivian years, the years when he had been just a man trying to build something and she had been just a woman who believed in him. He looked at her like he used to look at her when he was tired and uncertain, and she was the thing he reached for. She felt the pull of it. She had loved this man for 9 years. You do not stop loving someone in 2 weeks simply because you have decided to stop letting them hurt you. Love and choice are different muscles, and they do not always agree. But she had 4 heartbeats to think about, and she had made a decision. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Take care of the children Vivian is carrying. Do better than you did with me." She walked away. She did not look back. Security, the gate, the boarding announcement, the long corridor of the jetway, and then the cabin of the plane, cool and dim, and the particular relief of a space that belonged to no one in particular, that was in transit, that was neither where you came from nor where you were going. She buckled her seatbelt. She put her hands on her stomach. "We're going," she said softly. The plane lifted. Chicago fell away beneath her. The grid of streets and the silver strip of the lake and the skyline she had woken up to for 7 years, shrinking and then disappearing into cloud, and Madeline Harper turned her face forward and did not look back through the window. She was 3 months pregnant with quadruplets, flying alone to a country she had visited once on a business trip years ago, carrying $80 million in a secure account and an envelope that she intended to release at exactly the right moment. She had never in her life felt so terrified. She had never in her life felt so free. The 14 hours passed the way long flights pass when your body is doing something extraordinary, in fragments of sleep and wakefulness, in the particular suspension of normal time that happens 30,000 feet above the ground. She ate what the flight attendant brought her. She drank water carefully. She read for a while and then stopped because the words weren't reaching her mind somewhere else entirely, running through plans and contingencies and the long list of things she needed to accomplish in the first week after landing. The woman next to her, a retired schoolteacher from Melbourne named Grace, who had been visiting a sister in Chicago, noticed at some point during the flight that Madeline was pregnant. "First one?" Grace asked with the cheerful directness of a woman who has raised children and therefore feels entitled to ask about them. Madeline smiled. "No," she said. And then, because something about the question and the altitude and the particular vulnerability of being in between places made her want to be honest with someone, she said 4. Grace stared at her. 4 babies, traveling alone, yes. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and patted Madeline's hand with the firm, certain warmth of a woman who has seen hard things and knows what they look like. Good for you, Grace said. It was such a simple thing. Such a plain, uncomplicated thing. Good for you, not are you sure, not that must be so difficult. Just good for you. The ways you say it when you mean it. When you recognize someone doing something hard and you want to acknowledge it without making it smaller. Madeline had to look out the window for a minute. Thank you, she said when she had herself back. Sydney came up below them in the early morning light, the harbor enormous and gleaming, the bridge and the opera house visible even from this height, the whole city arranged at the edge of the water like something that had been placed there very deliberately. She cleared customs. She collected her single suitcase. She walked out into the arrivals hall and found the car she had arranged and gave the driver the address of the apartment she had never seen in person, only in photographs, and the city opened around her, unfamiliar and entirely itself, and Madeline breathed it in and thought, this is where it starts. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in Surrey Hills, 2 bedrooms for now with the intention of moving somewhere larger before the babies came. It had large windows and wooden floors and a kitchen that was smaller than she was used to, but clean and well-equipped. The property manager, a compact, efficient woman named Sandra who shook hands like she meant it, handed over the keys and gave her a 10-minute orientation and left her alone. Madeline stood in the empty living room. She had a suitcase, a carry-on bag, a laptop, a phone, an envelope she was not sending yet, 4 babies she was not telling anyone about yet, and a life she was building from the ground up. She unpacked her suitcase methodically. She made up the bed with the sheets she had bought before leaving Chicago and shipped ahead. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and opened her business plan document and read through it from the beginning, which was something she did whenever she was in a new place and feeling unmoored. The plan reminded her of what she was doing and why. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown Australian number. Miss Harper, this is Dr. Anita Osei confirming your appointment tomorrow morning at 9. Antenatal Specialist, St. Vincent's Hospital. Please bring your existing medical records. She had arranged the appointment from Chicago. She texted back a confirmation and set her phone face down on the table. Then she opened a new document and began writing the first draft of what would eventually become the company's mission statement. She wrote, "Design is not decoration. Design is the decision to claim your own space in the world." She looked at that sentence for a long time, then she kept writing. Back in Chicago, 3 days after Madeline's plane had crossed the Pacific, Eleanor Whitmore was having lunch with her closest friend, Patricia Langford, at their usual table at the restaurant where Eleanor had been having lunch with Patricia for the better part of 30 years. Patricia already knew the broad strokes. Everyone in Eleanor's circle knew the broad strokes by now because Eleanor had decided that transparency, strategic and managed transparency, was the best way to control the narrative. The settlement was generous, Eleanor said, cutting her salmon with the precision of a woman who does everything with precision. Very generous. She'll be well taken care of, I'm sure, Patricia said. She had the tact not to say what she was thinking, which was that generous and fair were not the same word. Julian and Vivian are meeting with the venue coordinator this afternoon, Eleanor continued. We're thinking spring, March. It gives Vivian time to recover from the birth and still have the wedding she deserves, and the babies due in January. Eleanor set down her fork. 2 perfect Whitmore heirs, a boy and a girl, Patricia nodded. And Madeline? The name sat on the table between them. Madeline made her choice, Eleanor said, picking her fork back up. She took her money and she left. That chapter is closed. What Eleanor did not know, what she would not know for several more months, was that the chapter was not closed at all. It had barely begun. 3 weeks after arriving in Sydney, Madeline sat in Dr. Osei's office for her second appointment and listened to 4 heartbeats amplified through an ultrasound machine and felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in years. Certainty, not happiness, exactly not yet. She was still too raw for uncomplicated happiness. But certainty, the feeling of standing on ground that held. All 4 are progressing beautifully, Dr. Osei said. She was a compact, precise woman with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a manner that was professional without being cold. You're past the highest risk window now. I want to see you every 2 weeks from this point. Of course, Madeline said. I also want you to think about your support structure, doctor. Osi said, quadruplet pregnancies are physically demanding. You need people around you. Family, friends, someone who can be with you in the later months. I'm working on that, Madeline said. She was. She had begun making connections in Sydney with the particular deliberate intentionality of a woman who understood that community was not something that happened to you, but something you built. She had joined a local business networking group. She had been introduced through that group to a woman named Priya Anand, a marketing consultant who had started her own firm 3 years ago and who had the kind of direct, unsentimental warmth that Madeline recognized as the warmth of someone who had also been through something difficult and had come out the other side still willing to trust people. They had coffee twice, then dinner, then coffee again. What brought you to Sydney? Priya asked at their third meeting, without any of the cautious indirectness Madeline had been braced for. Madeline looked at her across the table. She had prepared an answer for this question. Vague and true enough, a fresh start, a business opportunity. The desire for a change of scene. But something about Priya's directness made the prepared answer feel dishonest in a way that the full truth would not have felt. A divorce, Madeline said, a very expensive one. From a man who spent 3 years with his executive assistant while letting me believe I couldn't have children. Priya was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. And the bump, she asked, nodding toward Madeline's now visible pregnancy. His, Madeline said, he doesn't know. Another 2 seconds of quiet. Then Priya said, okay, what do you need? And with how Madeline found her first real friend in Sydney. The business began to take shape in a way that surprised even Madeline, who had planned it carefully but had not quite anticipated how quickly it would find its identity once she gave it room to breathe. She called it Reclaim, interior design and consulting for women in transition. Women who had left marriages, ended partnership, moved, rebuilt lives, women who needed their spaces to reflect who they were becoming. The first 3 clients came through Priya's network. All 3 were women in their late 30s to early 50s. All 3 were in some version of the situation Madeline understood from the inside. All 3 cried at some point during the initial consultation, not because Madeline asked them to or created space for it artificially, but because there was something about sitting with a woman who understood and was not going to judge them that made the emotions simply come. Madeline did not make the consultations about their pain. She made them about their vision. Tell me what you want your life to look like, she would say. Not what it used to look like, not what it was supposed to look like. What you actually want, the answers were always specific, always surprising, always real. She worked 12 hours a day and slept 8 and spent the remaining 4 doing the things her body required, eating carefully, walking slowly along the streets near her apartment, going to her appointments with Dr. Osi, and sitting in the evenings with her hand on her stomach, talking to the 4 lives growing inside her in the quiet, private way that mothers talk to their children before those children can respond. You are going to have a good life, she told them. I promise you that. I am going to build you a good life. In Chicago, the winter moved towards spring. Julian's texts had stopped after the first week. She had not responded to any of them, and eventually he had stopped sending them, which was the expected outcome, and also in a small, bruised place she was not proud of, slightly painful. But she had not expected him to stop so quickly, which told her something about the depth of the grief on his end. Eleanor sent nothing. Madeline had not expected her to. What she had not expected was the message that arrived in early December, not from a Whitmore but from someone else entirely. A woman named Claire, who had worked in the Whitmore Group's legal department for 4 years, whom Madeline had known well enough to exchange pleasantries with at company events, but not, listen up, as close acquaintance says. The message was brief. I don't know if this is appropriate, Claire wrote. I've been going back and forth about sending this for 3 weeks. I thought you should know that some of what was in your settlement agreement may not be enforceable the way Eleanor's lawyers implied. The non-disclosure clause has limitations under Illinois law that they didn't explain to you. I don't know if you have plans to say anything publicly or not. That's entirely your business, but I thought someone should tell you. Madeline read this message 4 times. Then she called a lawyer, not a Chicago lawyer, not anyone connected to the Whitmore network. An international family law specialist in Sydney whom Priya had recommended, a tall, methodical man named David Lim, who listens to Madeline explain her situation without interrupting, and then asked 3 very precise questions and then said, the non-disclosure clause in your agreement is almost certainly unenforceable as written. There are specific carve-outs under both Illinois law and international treaty that would allow you to disclose certain facts, particularly facts relating to paternity of children, particularly when those facts affect legal rights. Madeline was quiet for a moment. Legal rights, she said. Your children's rights, David said. To identify their father, to potential inheritance claims, to medical history. The Whitmore Agreement cannot legally bar you from establishing legal paternity, and it cannot legally prevent you from acting in your children's legal interests. Something shifted in Madeline's chest, not the underground river of anger, something quieter. Something like the feeling of a door opening that you had been told was locked. I need to think about this, she said. Of course, David said. There's no urgency right now, but as you get closer to the birth, these questions will become more relevant. She thanked him. She sat in her apartment for a long time after that call. She had been planning to send the envelope at the moment of Julian's wedding. She had planned it as a single clean action, the delivery of the truth at the moment of maximum impact, not for cruelty. She had examined her motives carefully enough to be honest about this, but because she believed the truth deserved to exist in the world, and it deserved to exist at the moment when it could not be quietly managed and filed away. But David's call had added a dimension she had not fully considered. Legal rights, her children's rights, that changed the calculation. She called David back the following morning. If I establish legal paternity through the courts, she said, can the Whitmore family challenge the settlement? They can try, David said. But the settlement was reached under conditions that arguably involved material misrepresentation. You were not informed that you were pregnant at the time of signing, or more precisely, you had not disclosed it, but they also had not disclosed the full picture. A good lawyer could make arguments in either direction. What would you advise? I would advise, David said, that you document everything you have, that you have the DNA testing done through a certified international lab the moment your children are born, and that you take no action on any of this until you've had a chance to review the complete legal landscape with me. That's what I intend to do, Madeline said. She ended the call, and then she did something she hadn't planned. She opened her laptop and she wrote a long email to Claire. Not to ask for more information, not to involve Claire in anything that might put her at risk. Simply to say thank you, and to say it in a way that meant something, that acknowledged what it had cost Claire to reach out when she didn't have to, when doing so was not in any obvious way in her interest. Claire wrote back within an hour. I've been at that company for 4 years and I've watched Eleanor Whitmore make decisions like this about people, and I've been quiet about it because I need my job and I was afraid, and I'm not proud of any of that. You were always kind to me at those events. That's not nothing. You were always kind to me. Madeline thought about that for a long time. She thought about all the small moments of kindness she had extended over 7 years at Whitmore events and dinners and office functions. The genuine interest she had taken in the people around her. The names she remembered. The questions she asked and actually listened to the answers of. She had done those things because that was simply who she was. Not because she was strategic, not because she was building a network. But the world had a way of giving back what you put into it. Sometimes years later, sometimes from directions you never expected. She saved Claire's email. She added it to the folder. January arrived with a heat that surprised her, because she kept forgetting that seasons worked differently here, that January in Sydney meant high summer, long evenings and warm nights, and the harbor full of people on boats. She was 34 weeks pregnant. Dr. Osis had been clear at her last appointment. The babies would not wait until their due date. Quadruplets never did. They were likely to arrive sometime in the next 2 to 4 weeks, and Dr. Osi wanted Madeline in the hospital and ready. Is there someone who will be with you? Dr. Osi asked at that appointment. Her voice professionally neutral, but her eyes asking something more personal. Yes, Madeline said. Priya had already cleared her calendar for January. She had done this without being asked, simply announced it one evening over dinner, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a woman who has decided something. I'm going to be there, Priya had said. You are not having 4 babies alone. You don't have to, Madeline. Priya had given her a look that ended the sentence. You are not having 4 babies alone. She hadn't been alone. The babies arrived on January 19th, a Sunday morning, warm and bright with the city going about its business outside the hospital windows. 2 boys, 2 girls, all healthy, all with strong lungs that they immediately and enthusiastically demonstrated. Madeline held the smallest of them first, a girl red-faced and furious and perfect, and felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a word for, Something that was not just love, because love was too small a word for it. Something more like the recognition of the entire reason you exist. The moment when everything that came before makes sense, because it led to this. She cried not from grief, not from the pain of the past 7 months, but from the overwhelming absolute certainty of love. Priya was there and she was crying too and trying to pretend she wasn't, which was characteristic of her, and Madeline laughed through her tears and reached out and took Priya's hand. 4, Priya said, slightly dazed, looking at the 4 small beds in the NICU where the babies were being monitored. 4, Madeline confirmed. You are an extraordinary person, Priya said. I'm a terrified person, Madeline said. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Priya said, and squeezed her hand. The DNA testing had already been arranged through David Lim's referral, a certified international paternity testing laboratory that worked directly with legal processes across jurisdictions. Cells had been collected at birth, everything handled correctly and documented carefully. Chain of custody intact, the results were expected in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, Julian Whitmore was scheduled to marry Vivian Blake. The timing was not accidental. Madeline had not engineered it to be cruel. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own mind. She had engineered it because the truth had a right to exist, and because her children had rights that the Whitmore family's money could not buy away, and because Eleanor had stood in her kitchen and called her nothing, and she had stood quietly and let it happen because she knew this moment was coming. She spent the weeks after the birth in the specific exhausted bliss of new parenthood multiplied by 4, feeding and holding and soothing and staring at 4 small faces with the stunned wonder of someone who still cannot quite believe what has happened, who keeps expecting to wake up. She hired a night nurse because she was not capable of doing everything alone, and because asking for help was not weakness. It was strategy, it was the decision to survive so that she could continue to show up for the 4 people who needed her to be standing. She worked in small increments when the babies slept. Reclaim had 2 new clients. Priya was handling the marketing. The business was real now, generating income, building reputation, coming the thing she had envisioned in that hazo months ago, when she had been alone and frightened and certain only that she had to move forward. She was moving forward. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning in late February, delivered electronically to David Lim's office and forwarded to her within the hour. She opened the email. She read the first line. Paternity confirmed. Julian Robert Whitmore is the biological father of all 4 children. All 4. She sat for a moment with that sentence. Then she called David. What do we do now? She asked. Now David said, we prepare the documentation package. Everything goes together, the paternity results, the supporting legal brief, the documentation you gathered before you left Chicago. I'll have a full package ready within a week. And the courier? I've been in contact with the service you specified. They're ready when you are. Madeline looked at the date on her calendar. March 15th, 12 days away. She thought about Julian standing in the airport in his dark coat. She thought about Eleanor's hands slamming the folder onto her kitchen table. She thought about the word nothing. She looked at the baby monitor on her desk, showing 4 small shapes sleeping in the next room. Have the package ready in 5 days, she said. I want it sent on the 10th. That will put it arriving on the 15th, David said. I know, she said. She ended the call. She went into the baby's room and stood in the doorway and watched them sleep. The way parents do, the way she had been doing every chance she got for the past 6 weeks, storing up images of them like provisions against a long winter. They were going to know who they were. They were going to know where they came from. They were going to have every right they were entitled to, every legal protection, every piece of their own identity. She had made a promise in that hospital room, and she intended to keep it. On March 10th, a package left Sydney in the hands of an international courier service. The destination, the Grand Ballroom, Whitmore Tower Hotel, Chicago, Illinois. Delivery date March 15th. Time 1 p.m. Inside the envelope was a medical report, a DNA, a legal brief prepared by David Lim, a letter from Madeline, and a small photograph. The photograph was of 4 sleeping babies. 2 boys, 2 girls, Julian Whitmore's children, all of them perfect. All of them healthy, all of them entirely undeniably real. The package crossed the Pacific. It moved through customs. It arrived at the hotel loading dock on the morning of March 15th, just as 700 guests were beginning to fill the ballroom below, and a woman in a white wedding gown was standing in a bridal suite on the 14th floor looking at herself in a mirror, while Eleanor Whitmore fastened the buttons at her back. The wedding was about to begin. The truth was in the building. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Tower Hotel had been transformed over the course of 3 days into something that Eleanor Whitmore considered a masterpiece of understated elegance, which in practice meant $300,000 worth of white roses, ivory silk draping, crystal candelabras on every table, and a string quartet positioned near the entrance playing music that had been selected by a consultant whose sole job was selecting music for occasions exactly like this one. 700 guests, politicians, business leaders, society figures whose names appeared regularly in the Tribune's society pages. Old money and new money seated side by side in the careful arrangement that Eleanor had overseen personally, because seating charts at events like this were not logistics, they were strategy, and Eleanor Whitmore had always understood that strategy was the most important thing. By 12:45, the ballroom was almost full. The energy in the room was the particular energy of expensive weddings, anticipatory and slightly performative. People in their finest clothes turning to greet each other with the heightened warmth that formal occasions produce. The feeling that today, for a few hours at least, everything was exactly as it should be. Eleanor stood at the back of the ballroom and surveyed it all with the satisfaction of a general looking out at a battlefield she has already won. Everything was in order. Julian was at the front of the room with the judge and his best man, Carter Wells, a college friend who had known Notion for 20 years and who was currently telling some story that made Julian laugh. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind Eleanor had not heard from her son in months. Good, she thought, he needed this. They both needed this. The ugliness of the past several months needed to be put behind them, and this was how you put things behind you. You celebrated, you moved forward, you made the future so bright and full that the past receded naturally into shadow. She had not thought about Madeline in 3 weeks. She intended to continue not thinking about her. On the 14th floor, in the bridal suite, Vivian Blake stood in front of a full-length mirror in a gown that had taken 4 months to make and cost more than most people's annual salary, and looked at her own reflection with an expression that her maid of honor, a friend named Tess, could not quite read. "You look incredible," Tess said. "I know," Vivian said, but she said it without the satisfaction the words should have carried. She was 6 weeks postpartum. The twins, a boy named Archer and a girl named Celeste, were downstairs in a suite with 2 nurses Eleanor had hired. The birth had been smooth. The babies were healthy. Everything had gone exactly according to the plan that Eleanor had been orchestrating for the better part of 2 years. So why did Vivian feel, standing in this gown in this suite on this morning, that was supposed to be the best awesome morning, like something was wrong? She couldn't name it. She had been trying to name it for weeks. This persistent unease, this feeling of a floor that looked solid but gave slightly under her feet when she stepped in certain places. "Vivian," Tess said, "we need to get downstairs in 15 minutes. "I know," Vivian said again. She looked at herself in the mirror. She thought about Madeline. She thought about Madeline more than she wanted to admit. More than she thought was probably healthy. Not with guilt. Exactly, she had worked very hard to reframe guilt into something more manageable, into the understanding that these things happened, that hearts were complicated, that she and Julian had not set out to hurt anyone. But with something that felt, if she was honest with herself in the way she rarely allowed herself to be, a great deal like the particular unease of knowing that somewhere, a consequence you cannot see is still moving toward you. She pushed the thought away. She let Tess hand her the bouquet. She walked toward the elevator. The ceremony was scheduled for 1 o'clock. At 12:58, a man in a gray courier uniform walked through the service entrance of the Whitmore Tower Hotel carrying a padded envelope and a handheld scanner. He had already checked in at the front desk. He had the correct delivery address. He had a signature requirement. The recipient was listed as Julian Robert Whitmore, personal delivery. To be delivered to the Grand Ballroom, Whitmore Tower Hotel. Do not leave with staff. The hotel event coordinator, a young woman named Becca, who was managing the logistical flow of 700 people with the controlled urgency of an air traffic controller, tried to intercept him at the ballroom entrance. "Sir, deliveries need to go through the back office." "Personal delivery for Julian Whitmore," the courier said, holding up the scanner with the delivery instructions visible. Signature required from the named recipient only. Becca looked at the scanner. She looked at the ballroom, where the ceremony was 45 seconds from beginning. "This is extremely bad timing," she said. "I understand," the courier said, "but my instructions are specific." Becca pulled out her radio. The ceremony began. The string quartet shifted from the ambient pre-ceremony music to the processional, and the 700 guests in the ballroom rose to their feet and turned toward the entrance. And the doors opened, and Vivian appeared, and there was the collective intake of breath that beautiful brides at expensive weddings reliably produce. She walked down the aisle on the arm of her father, a quiet man named Robert Blake who had driven up from Springfield and who looked slightly overwhelmed by all of it, by the scale and the grandeur and the number of people watching his daughter walk past them. Julian watched her come. He was smiling. He had told himself, coming into today, that he was choosing this, that this was right, that Archer and Celeste needed their parents married, that Vivian was a good woman and they had something real, and the circumstances of how they had arrived here did not negate the reality of what they could build together. He had told himself this enough times that he mostly believed it. Vivian reached him. She took his hand. The judge began to speak. And at that exact moment, through the ballroom side door, Becca appeared with the courier behind her, walking quickly toward the front of the room, her face set in the particular expression of someone who has been told to do something, and is doing it while internally constructing the email she will send to his manager about proper delivery protocols. Julian saw her coming. He saw the uniform. He saw the envelope. He felt something cold move through him. The judge was still speaking, something about the nature of commitment, about choosing each other. The words washing past Julian without landing because something in his chest had locked onto that gray uniform and that padded envelope with the focus of an animal that senses danger before it can identify the source. "Mr. Whitmore," Becca said quietly, reaching the front of the room. "I apologize for the interruption. There's a personal delivery that requires your signature. The courier says it can't wait. 700 people were watching." Eleanor, seated in the front row, turned and looked at the courier with an expression that could have cured concrete. "This is not the time," she said, low and controlled. "Ma'am, I have instructions," Vivian said quietly. Her hand had tensed in his. She had felt it too, that animal warning, the floor giving slightly under her feet. Julian looked at Becca. At the envelope, at the return address, Sydney, Australia. The world went very quiet. He signed for the package. His hands were steady. He was proud of that afterward. In the fragmented way you notice small things during large events. His hands were steady when he signed. He held the envelope. The judge had stopped speaking. The room was entirely silent in the way that large rooms full of people go silent when something unexpected has happened, and no one yet knows whether it is nothing or everything. "Julian," Eleanor said, standing now, "put it away. We can look at it after it." He was not conscious of making the decision. His hands simply did it, the way hands sometimes act faster than minds, sliding under the sealed flap and pulling it open before the calculating part of his brain could decide whether that was wise. Inside was a document, thick, formally bound, several pages behind a cover sheet with a legal firm's letterhead, Lim & Associates, Sydney. Beneath that, a separate sealed envelope with his name on it in handwriting he recognized immediately. Madeline's handwriting. He set legal document aside without reading it and opens the smaller envelope first. Her letter was 2 pages. He wrote standing at the front of the room with 700 people watching, and his bride's hand still in his. Though Vivian had released it slightly, her fingers slack, as if her body already knew something her mind was still refusing. He read the first paragraph. He read it again. He turned to the legal document. He found the cover page of the DNA test. His eyes moved to the key finding, the line that was highlighted in yellow with the particular precision of a lawyer who understands which line matters most. Paternity confirmed. Julian Robert Whitmore is the biological father of all 4 children, born January 19th to Madeline Claire Harper. 4 children. He looked up. Vivian was watching his face. She had always been good at reading his face. It was one of the things that had drawn her to him in the first place. This particular transparency he had, the way his inner life surfaced in his expression despite his best efforts to control it. She read his face now and she knew. "No," she said. It came out barely above a whisper. "No, Julian." Eleanor's voice, sharp and commanding. "What is it? What does it say?" He looked at his mother. He had in his life seen Eleanor Whitmore frightened exactly twice. Once when his father had his first heart attack and she had found out by phone. Once when the company's biggest client had threatened to pull out and take 40% of their revenue with them. This was the 3rd time, because she could see it in his face before he said a word. "Madeline has 4 children," Julian said. His voice was very quiet. The room was so silent that it carried to every corner. "She gave birth on January 19th, 2 girls, The DNA test, he stopped. He looked at the document again, as if looking at it one more time might change what it said. They're mine, all 4 of them. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the ballroom erupted. 700 people generating the specific noise of collective shock. Whispers that cascaded into talking that turned into the movement of bodies shifting and turning, the sound of chairs, the sound of phones being lifted, the sound of a story that was already writing itself and would be in every news feed in Chicago within the hour. Vivian sat down. She did not sit down gracefully. There was a chair behind her, one of the chairs that had been placed for the wedding party, and she reached for it and sat down with the careful urgency of someone whose legs have informed them they are done cooperating. Her father stepped toward her. "Vivian, don't," she said. Her voice was strange, flat. "Just don't right now." Eleanor took the document from Julian's hands. She read the cover page. Her face, which had been many things in the years Madeline had known her, cold, commanding, satisfied, occasionally even warm in the particular way of women who've warmth for people they consider worthy of it, did something Madeline had never seen it do. It collapsed. Not dramatically. Eleanor was too controlled for drama. But the muscles of it, the held tension that gave Eleanor Whitmore her particular expression of permanent authority, let go just slightly, just enough. "This can't be right," Eleanor said. "It's a certified international lab," Julian said. He had the legal brief in his hands now, reading quickly. Lim and Associates prepared the documentation. David Lim is a senior family law specialist. It's been done correctly. It's legal, it's binding. She never told us she was pregnant. She didn't have to, Julian said. He said it quietly, but there was something in it. A judgment, a reckoning, the particular weight of a man who is in the process of understanding what he did. She didn't have to tell them. They had put her in a room and called her nothing. They had offered her money and called it generosity. They had handed her a pen and a document and a condition of silence, and they had believed, truly believed, that was the end of the story. Madeline had known something they hadn't. That the story you refuse to tell doesn't end, it waits. Carter Wells, Julian's best man, appeared at his shoulder. Carter had known Julian for 20 years, long enough to set aside the protocols of a wedding day and speak plainly. "Julian, you need to step out of this room." "Yes," Julian said. "Julian," Eleanor caught his arm, "don't do anything impulsive. We need to talk to the lawyers before, Mother." He said it the way he almost never said it, flat and final, the way a door closes. "My children, she had them alone, she raised them alone. She built a life alone." He looked at Eleanor's hand on his arm until she released it. "We need to talk, but not here." He walked out of the ballroom. Carter followed. Vivian sat in her chair in her wedding gown while her father stood beside her, not knowing what to say, which was the honest and correct response to the situation, and 700 guests generated the noise of a story that would not stay contained. Eleanor stood with the document in her hands and looked at the room, at the people watching her, at the evidence of everything she had built so carefully coming apart in a way she had not planned for, had not even considered possible. She had called Madeline nothing. She was going to have to live with that. In the hotel corridor outside the ballroom, Julian sat on a bench with the document open in his lap. Carter sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. "4," Carter said finally. "4," Julian confirmed. 2 boys and 2 girls. Born January 9th, Carter was quiet for a moment. "So she was pregnant when she signed the divorce papers?" "Yes." "And she didn't tell you?" "No." Carter chose his next word careful, so, which was not always his natural mode, but which the situation clearly demanded. "Why? Why wouldn't she tell you?" Julian looked at the document. He thought about Madeline standing at the kitchen sink with the water running, her back to him. He thought about her face in the airport, the particular steadiness of it, the quality of someone who has made a decision so completely that it has become part of them. "Because she knew what would happen if she did," Julian said. "My mother would have used it. The lawyers would have used it. The pregnancy would have become leverage, a negotiating tool, something to be managed. Madeline would have spent the next decade fighting us in court over children that were entirely hers to love." He closed his eyes briefly. "She protected them," he said. "She protected them from us." The weight of that sat between them. Carter, who had known Julian since they were 22 years old and shared an apartment and split the cost of bad furniture, and stayed up too late talking about what they were going to make of themselves, said the only thing there was to say, "You need to call her." "I know, Julian. Not after you've talked to a lawyer. Not after your mother has a plan." Now, Julian looked at his phone. He had Madeline's number still. He had never deleted it. He had told himself that was simply negligence. that he had not gotten around to it, but sitting in a hotel corridor in his wedding suit with 4 children's DNA results in his hands, he was no longer telling himself that particular story. He dialed, it rang 3 times. Julian, her voice was exactly as he remembered it. Quiet, steady, unsurprised Madeline, a pause. Is the courier there? She asked. The courier has been and gone, he said. The whole ballroom knows. Another pause. Shorter. Good, she said. The word contained everything. 7 years, the fertility treatments, the airport, the silence of his absence. The 4 lives she had built and the time it had taken him to arrange flowers for someone else's wedding. I have 4 children, he said. His voice broke slightly on the last word, which surprised him. He had not expected that. You do, Madeline said. Why didn't you tell me before the papers, before you left? Why didn't you? Because they are mine, she said. Because the moment I told you, they would have become a legal situation. A settlement negotiation. An argument between your mother's lawyers and mine. I wasn't going to let that happen. They have a right to know their father. They will know the truth of their history when they are old enough to understand it, Madeline said. That's my decision to make, not yours, not Eleanor's. Mine. Julian pressed his hand over his eyes. I know, he said. I know that. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just started again. I have missed 7 years of my own life because I made terrible choices, and I didn't understand what I had until it was gone, and I have been sitting with that since the day you walked through security and didn't look back. And I, Julius, was firm but not unkind. Stop, he stopped. I am not the answer to your grief, she said. I am the person you hurt. Those are 2 different things, and you need to understand the difference before we can have any conversation about those children. I understand, he said. Do you? A long pause. I'm trying to, he said. On the other end of the line, in Sydney, in the apartment in Surrey Hills where 4 babies were asleep in the next room, and the morning light was coming through the windows the way it always did, soft and gold and indifferent to everything that had happened or was happening 12,000 miles away, Madeline sat at her kitchen table with her phone to her ear and her free hand flat on the wood, and she breathed. She had imagined this call. She had not imagined feeling this way during it. She had expected anger, perhaps, or the cold satisfaction of having been right. She had expected to feel powerful, or vindicated, or at the very least resolved. What she felt instead was tired, not defeated tired. Not broken tired, the kind of tired that comes after a very long run, when you have done the thing you set out to do and your body is telling you the effort cost something, and you need to acknowledge that. My lawyer's name is David Lim, she said. He will reach out to you about the children's legal status. Their birth certificates, their right to their father's identity, whatever the law requires. I'm not going to fight you on the things they're legally entitled to. But I need you to understand something. Tell me, Julian said. They are mine, she said again. They live with me. They are being raised by me. They know their mother, and they know Sydney, and they know Priya, who is the closest thing to an aunt they have in this world. The life I have built for them is real, and it is good, and it is not going to be disrupted. I'm not asking to disrupt it. Then we might be able to talk, she said. But no, he agreed, not today. A pause. Are they healthy, he asked. She heard it in his voice. The genuine question underneath the question. The father asking what the man who had failed could not quite ask directly. She let herself be generous. She had 4 healthy children asleep in the next room. She could afford to be generous. They are extraordinary, she said. Every single one of them. She heard him exhale. Thank you, he said. She ended the call. She set her phone on the table. She sat for a moment in the kitchen of her apartment in Sydney with the gold light coming through the windows. Then she stood up and went into the baby's room and stood in the doorway and looked at 4 sleeping faces. 2 boys, healthy and perfect and entirely hers. She had kept her promise. Back in Chicago, the wedding that was no longer happening was producing consequences at a speed that no one in the Whitmore orbit had been prepared for. 700 people had phones. 700 people had social media accounts and text message chains, and the specific social compulsion to share extraordinary things with the people who had not been there to witness them. By 2 p.m, the story was everywhere. Not just Chicago, everywhere. The narrative was simple enough to travel fast and complex enough to be irresistible. Prominent businessman, affair, first wife paid to disappear. First wife secretly pregnant with quadruplets. First wife builds new life in Australia. First wife sends DNA results to wedding. The details made it real. The 4 children made it human. The timing made it extraordinary. Eleanor's phone rang continuously. She did not answer it. She sat in the bridal suite on the 14th floor. where she had gone after the ballroom cleared, because she had needed a room with a door she could close, and this one was available and empty. Vivian had gone home with her father and the twins hours ago. Quietly through the service entrance, Tess on one side and Robert Blake on the other. The wedding gown replaced with clothes she had brought in a bag that her maid of honor had thought to bring just in case, because even on a perfect day, you brought a backup plan. The gown was hanging in the closet of the suite. Eleanor looked at it. She thought about Madeline standing in the kitchen with the water running. The way Madeline had set down the ultrasound photo and looked at it for a moment and then set it down without expression. The way she had said, "I'd like you to leave my house with something," underneath the words that Eleanor had recognized at the time, but had chosen to dismiss, because dismissing things was sometimes easier than understanding them. She thought about what she had said. 7 years and you gave this family nothing. Nothing. She thought about 4 children, born in January in Sydney, Australia, 2 boys, 2 girls, all healthy. She thought about the word nothing. Her phone rang again. She looked at the screen in. She answered. "Where are you?" he asked. 14th floor, stay there. "I'm coming up." He arrived 5 minutes later and sat across from her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, mother and son in the wreckage of the day they had built. "What do we do?" Eleanor asked. It was not a question she often asked. Eleanor was not a woman who typically needed to ask what to do. She had a plan. She always had a plan. "I don't know yet," Julian said. "But I need to tell you something." "What?" "Madeline built a company," he said, "in Sydney, interior design for women starting over. It's called Reclaim. I looked it up while you were upstairs." He paused. "It's doing well. She's good at it. She built something real." Eleanor said nothing. "She had 4 children alone," Julian continued. "She moved to another country alone. She started a business alone. While we were planning a wedding and thinking we had solved the problem, and she simply wasn't our problem anymore. She was building something. The quiet in the suite had a particular quality. The quiet of reckoning. I called her nothing," Eleanor said. "Yes," Julian said. Eleanor looked at the wedding gown in the closet. "What does she want?" Eleanor asked. "From us. From this. She wants David Lim to contact our lawyers about the children's legal status," Julian said. "Beyond that, I think she wants us to understand what we did. Not to apologize necessarily, not today, not right now. I think she wants us to actually understand it." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Outside, Chicago was going about its afternoon business, indifferent to the Whitmore family's reckoning, the way cities are always indifferent to individual catastrophes. The traffic moving and the lake shining and the thousands of lives proceeding forward in their own directions. "Oh, or an apology," Eleanor said. "Yes," Julian said. "You do. She won't want to hear it right now." "Probably not," Julian agreed. "But that doesn't mean you stop owing it." Eleanor reached out and picked up the DNA report from where it had been sitting on the suite's coffee table. She looked at the first line again. Paternity confirmed. Julian Robert Whitmore is the biological father of all 4 children. 4 children. She thought about holding Julian when he was born. That specific weight and warmth. The complete reorganization of your priorities that happens in the first moment of that experience. She thought about Madeline holding 4 babies alone in a hospital in Sydney. "She's stronger than I gave her credit for," Eleanor said. "She always was," Julian said. "We just weren't paying attention in Sydney." Madeline's phone had been ringing since mid-morning. She let most of it go to voicemail, journalists she did not know and did not want to know. A few old acquaintances from Chicago who had seen the news and were calling with the mixture of genuine concern and irresistible curiosity that these calls always contained. A reporter from a national morning program asking for a comment. She did not comment. She had made her statement. It was in the DNA report, in the legal brief, in the photograph of 4 sleeping babies. That was her statement. She did not need words beyond that. Priya arrived at her door at noon with food she had picked up on the way and set it on the kitchen table, and sat down and looked at Madeline with the direct, unsentimental assessment of a woman who knows you well. "How are you?" Priya asked. "Tired," Madeline said. "But okay, the news is everywhere, I know. Are you ready for that?" Madeline thought about it. "I was ready for it the day I sealed the envelope," she said. "I've had 2 months to prepare." Priya looked at her for a moment. "You are one of the most extraordinary people I have ever known," she said. "You've said that before. I'm going to keep saying it until you believe it." Madeline smiled. It was a real smile, not the performed smile of a woman getting through something hard. The real one, the one that reached her eyes, the one that meant she was, underneath all of it, underneath the exhaustion and the complexity, and the weight of the past several months, genuinely okay, better than okay. She was building something. The babies were healthy. The truth was in the world where it belonged. She picked up a piece of the food Priya had brought and ate it and felt, for the first time in months, actually hungry. "Tell me something good," she said to Priya. "Tell me about something that has nothing to do with any of this." Priya thought for a second. "The Hendricks project," she said. "The client called this morning. She wants to move forward with the full redesign," she said. Priya smiled. She said working with Reclaim is the first time she has felt like herself in years. Madeline absorbed that. The first time she has felt like herself in years. That was it, she thought. That was the whole thing right there. That was what she was building. Not a revenge, not a counter-narrative. Not a response to Eleanor Whitmore's cruelty or Julian's failure or the 7-year Nessa's been as lifespan in the wrong direction. She was building spaces where women could come back to themselves. She was building it out of the very wreckage they had made of her. And it was working. In the next room, one of the babies made a sound, a small, questioning noise, the kind that was not quite crying, but was the preliminary announcement of crying. Madeline stood up. She went into the room. She picked up the smallest one, the girl, the one with the most hair and the most opinions about everything, and held her against her chest and felt the small, warm weight of her settle. "Big day," she said softly. The baby looked up at her with the wide, dark, entirely present gaze of a 2-month-old, the gaze that sees everything and understands nothing and is somehow the most honest thing in the world. "Your story is just beginning," Madeline said, "and I promise you, it is going to be a good one." 3 days after the wedding that never happened, Chicago was still talking, not just talking, dissecting. The way a city dissects a story that touches something real, something that people recognize from their own lives, even if their own lives have never contained anything as dramatic as a DNA test delivered to a ballroom full of 700 witnesses. The Whitmore story had found its nerve, the particular nerve that gets activated when someone who was told they were nothing turns out to have been everything all along. It was on the morning news. It was on the evening news. It was in the Tribune and in every digital publication that covered Chicago society, and in several that did not typically cover Chicago society but had decided to make an exception. Julian had not left his penthouse apartment in 3 days. Carter was there. Carter had essentially moved in, appearing on the first morning with a bag and coffee, and the pragmatic loyalty of a man who understands that real friendship is not the kind you offer when things are good. Carter had been Julian's best man at what was supposed to be his wedding, and was now his companion in the aftermath of its collapse, making coffee and answering the door, and calls from journalists and doing impulsive things he hadn't wanted to do in the first 24 hours. "Don't call her again yet," Carter had said on the first morning. She has heard everything she needs to hear for right now," Carter said firmly. "Give her time, give yourself time. You just had your entire understanding of the past 8 months rearranged in about 4 minutes. You are not in a position to have productive conversations." Julian had wanted to argue with that. He had not been able to find the argument, so he had sat. And he had thought. He had thought about the fertility appointments. He kept coming back to those, the specific cruelty of them, the way he had sat beside Madeline in those waiting rooms holding her hand, while she went through something painful and unnecessary, while she carried the weight of a problem that was not hers to carry, while she blamed herself month after month for something she had never caused. He thought about the specific evening she had come home from an appointment with Dr. Farrell and sat down at the kitchen table and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "He wants to try a different protocol, more aggressive. It might help," and he had nodded and said, "Whatever you think," and had held her, while she cried a little from tiredness and hope and the grind of it, and he had said nothing, not a single word of the truth, while inside him the truth sat like a stone. He had told himself, at the time, that he was protecting her. He understood now, 3 days later in the wreckage of March 15th, that he had not been protecting her at all. He had been protecting himself from the confrontation, from her grief, from the consequence of his own choices. He had been a coward in a very expensive coat, sitting in a very clean waiting room and calling it compassion. The understanding of that cost him something. He sat with it because there was nothing else to do. On the 4th morning, he called David Lim, not Julian's lawyer, Madeline's lawyer. He had gotten the number from the legal documents she had sent, and he had thought for a long time about whether calling directly was appropriate, or whether it would be perceived as aggression or pressure. And then he had decided that the question of appropriateness was somewhat beside the point now. David Lim answered on the second ring. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. not surprised. Madeline had presumably told him to expect this call. "I want to understand what the right process is," Julian said. "For the children, not for me, for them. What do they need from me legally? Financially, in terms of recognition." A pause. "That's a good place to start," David said. "I'm not trying to complicate Madeline's life," Julian continued. "I'm not going to pursue custody arrangements she doesn't agree to. I understand these children are hers in every way that matters. I just want to know what I owe them." David was quiet for a moment, the considered quiet of a lawyer deciding how much to say. "Your children are currently listed on their birth certificates with their mother's surname," David said. "Paternity has been legally established. What happens next is largely a conversation between you and Ms. Harper with legal documentation of whatever you agree to. Child support, visitation arrangements, if any, legal recognition of paternity in the United States as well as Australia, inheritance rights. None of these things need to be adversarial." "They won't be," Julian said. "From my end, I'll convey that to Miss Harper. Tell her." Julian stopped. Started again. "Tell her I said the children's welfare is the only thing that matters. Tell her whatever arrangement she thinks is right for them, I will agree to." Another pause. "I'll tell her," David said. Julian ended the call and sat in his kitchen and drank his coffee and felt, underneath the grief and the guilt and the particular exhaustion of the past 4 days, something very small and fragile that he could only describe as the beginning of the desire to do better. It was not redemption. He understood clearly enough that redemption was not available to him at this price point, not yet, possibly not for a very long time, but it was a direction. It was the first step of a very long road that he had not yet earned the right to call anything other than obligation. He would take it. In Sydney, Madeline had spent the 3 days after March 15th doing something that surprised even her. She had been working, not hiding, not processing in isolation, not sitting with the enormity of what she had set in motion. She had been working because work was the thing that kept her feet on the ground, that reminded her that the life she was building was real and ongoing and not contingent on anything that was happening 12,000 miles away. Reclaim had received 47 new inquiries in the 72 hours following the news coverage. 47, not all of them were legitimate business inquiries. Some were journalists looking for access. Some were people with no connection to design services who simply wanted to express support or, in a few cases, criticism, but a significant portion of them, 31 by Madeline's careful count, were genuine inquiries from women who had found her company through the news coverage and recognized something in it. Women who were starting over, women who needed their spaces to reflect who they were becoming. Women who had read about Madeline Harper and thought, that is someone who understands. Priya had been fielding them with the methodical energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment without quite knowing it was coming. "This is the inflection point," Priya said on the third morning, sitting at Madeline's kitchen table with her laptop open and a spreadsheet of inquiries organized by type and urgency. "This is the moment where the company either scales or stays small. And I want to be clear about which one I think you should choose." "Scale," Madeline said. "Scale," Priya confirmed, "but carefully, we need to hire. We need to formalize the intake process. We need a website that reflects what the company actually is rather than what it was when you launched it 6 months ago." "I've been thinking about a foundation component," Madeline said. "Pro bono design services for women coming out of domestic violence situations. Women who genuinely have nothing and need their space to feel safe." Priya looked at her. "That's going to require funding separate from the business revenue." "I know. I have $80 million, a beat," right, Priya said. "You do. I've been thinking about how to use it responsibly," Madeline said. "The foundation is part of that, not a vanity project. A real operational foundation with proper governance. I want David to help me set it up legally." Priya was quiet for a moment in the way she went quiet when she was genuinely moved but did not want to be sentimental about it. "You know," she said, "most people who get a settlement like that put it in investments and spend the rest of their life protecting it." "I know," Madeline said. "You're going to spend it on other women." "Some of it," Madeline said. "Enough of it. The rest will go to my children's future." Priya nodded. "Okay," she said, "let's build a foundation." David Lim's call came that afternoon. He relayed Julian's message, whatever arrangement she thought was right for the children. He would owe contest, no counter-demands. Complete deference to her judgment. Madeline listened. She was quiet for a moment after David finished. "What do you think?" David asked. "I think he means it," she said. "Right now he means it. Whether he continues to mean it, when the emotional weight of all this settles and he starts to want more access or more involvement, I can't know. That's why we document everything, David said. Yes, I want a formal agreement, everything in writing. Child support at a level that reflects his actual income, not some negotiated down number. Legal recognition of paternity in both jurisdictions. Visitation terms that I set and he agrees to, and that include provisions for how any contact happens, where, under what conditions. All of that is standard and achievable, David said. What about Eleanor Whitmore? The question sat there for a moment. Eleanor. Madeline thought about Eleanor sitting in that kitchen with a folder and a cold voice and a certainty that she was solving a problem. Eleanor is not in the agreement, Madeline said. Julian is the children's father. Eleanor is a grandmother they may choose to know or not know when they are old enough to make that choice. That is not my decision to make for them, but Eleanor has no legal standing in this and I will not negotiate with her directly. Understood, David said. After the call, Madeline sat for a while. She thought about what it would mean for her children to know their father. She thought about it honestly, without the protective anger that had been her default for the past several months. Trying to see it clearly, they deserved to know where they came from. They deserved the truth of their own history. Whether Julian would be a good father, whether he had the capacity for that particular kind of sustained, unglamorous daily love that children required, she genuinely did not know. The Julian she had known at his best had been capable of real warmth. He had also been capable of the particular self-absorption that had allowed him to sit in those waiting rooms and say nothing. People changed. Sometimes she was not going to decide it for her children. She was going to build them a life so full and so grounded and so rich with love that whoever else entered or did not enter their story, they would be okay, that she could guarantee that she was already doing. The first week of April brought a development that no one had anticipated and that changed the shape of the story in a direction even Madeline had not fully planned for. A journalist named Sandra Park, who wrote for a national women's publication that had been covering the Whitmore story since March 15th with the kind of careful, substantive reporting that distinguished it from the gossip coverage that had dominated the first 48 hours, reached out to Priya with a request, not for a comment on the Whitmore situation, for a profile of Reclaim, of Madeline not as the woman who had sent the DNA results to Julian's wedding, but as the entrepreneur who had built a company from nothing in a new country while pregnant with quadruplets, while managing divorces, and a legal situation that would have broken most people. Priya had forwarded the request with a single line, "Your call, but I think this is worth doing." Madeline thought about it for 2 days. She thought about what she had agreed to when she signed the divorce papers. The non-disclosure clause that David had told her was largely unenforceable, but that she had been careful about anyway. Not because she feared the legal consequences, but because she had not wanted to appear to be conducting a campaign. The profile was not a disclosure of private information. The profile was about her company, but it would also be about her. And it would tell, by implication and by the honest account of who she was and how she had arrived where she was, a story that the Whitmore family would recognize. "I'll do it," she told Priya. "Any conditions? One, the children are not photographed or named. They can be mentioned 4 children, born in January. That's enough. Their faces and their names belong to them when they're old enough to decide. I'll convey that." The interview with Sandra Park happened over video call on a Thursday morning in early April, while the babies napped and the Sydney light came through the windows, and Madeline sat at her desk in the apartment that was already beginning to feel too small, not because it was actually small, but because 4 children and a growing company generated a gravitational pull toward more space. Sandra Park was in her early 40s, direct in the way of journalists who have been doing this long enough to know that the best interviews happen when everyone stops pretending. "Tell me about Reclaim," Sandra said, "not the backstory. Not what happened with your marriage. Tell me what the company actually is." Madeline appreciated the distinction. "It's a design company," she said, "but the design is almost secondary. What we're really doing is helping women reclaim their sense of self in a physical space. When you go through a major life transition, your environment reflects the person you were, not the person you're becoming. That dissonance is real. It has real psychological effects. Our work is about resolving that dissonance. And where did that idea come from?" Madeline smiled. "I spent 7 years in a house that was beautiful," she said. "Perfectly designed, expertly maintained, and it never felt like mine. It felt like a performance of someone else's idea of what my life should look like." Sandra nodded. She did not push further on that. She did not need to. "What has surprised you most about running this company?" Sandra asked. How fast it found its people, Madeline said. I thought I would spend years convincing people that this was a real need. I didn't have to. The women found us because the need was already there. It was just waiting for someone to build something for it. They talked for an hour. Madeline talked about the foundation she was building, about the pro bono work, about the women she had already worked with and what it had meant to watch them change, not because of anything magical, but because of the simple, powerful act of being taken seriously. She talked about being a mother to 4. It's the most demanding thing I have ever done, she said simply. And the most worth doing. Do you ever feel like you're doing too much? Sandra asked. Every day, Madeline said, and then one of them looks at me and I remember what it's all for and the question becomes irrelevant. The profile ran 3 weeks later. The headline was, she was called nothing, then she built everything. The photograph was of Madeline at her desk in her Sydney apartment, looking directly into the camera in the specific way she had when she was entirely present and entirely herself, the way she looked when she was not performing anything for anyone. She looked, everyone who knew her agreed, exactly like herself. The article was 7,000 words. It was shared more than 200,000 times in the first 48 hours. Madeline's phone rang continuously for a week. Investors, other entrepreneurs, women who wanted to tell her their stories. A producer at a morning television program in Sydney. A publisher in New York who wanted to talk about a book. She handled each call with the same steady, measured presence she brought to everything. She said yes to the things that aligned with what she was building. She said no to the things that were about the spectacle. She was building something real. She was not interested in spectacle. Eleanor Whitmore read the profile on a Tuesday morning in her Lakeshore Drive apartment. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. She had been doing a great deal of reading and rereading in the weeks since March 15th. Reading documents, reading legal briefs, reading the press coverage that she had initially tried to manage and then given up trying to manage because it had grown beyond anything management could contain. She set the magazine down on her coffee table. She sat with it for a long time. She had been speaking to a therapist, which was something she had not done in 30 years, and which she had agreed to do at Julian's insistence, not because she believed she needed it in the traditional sense, but because Julian had looked at her across the suite on the evening of March 15th and said, "Mother, you need to talk to someone who isn't me," in a tone that she said recognized, with some surprise as the tone of a man who had actually grown up. The therapist was a woman named Dr. Chen, who was approximately Eleanor's age, and who had the specific quality of listening, without reacting, that Eleanor found simultaneously irritating and, she had to admit, genuinely useful. "What did you feel when you read the article, Doctor?" Chen had asked at their most recent session. "Shame," Eleanor had said. And then, because she had not survived 71 years by being dishonest with herself, and something else, something like admiration, which I find very uncomfortable. Why uncomfortable? Because it requires me to admit that I was wrong about her, about what she was capable of, about who she was, and being wrong is uncomfortable. Being wrong about something this significant is more than uncomfortable, Eleanor said. It's a reckoning. What would it look like to reckon with it? Eleanor had thought about that for several days. In late April, she sat down at her writing desk and took out a piece of her personal stationery, the heavyweight cream paper she had been using for formal correspondence for 30 years. And she picked up a pen, not a typed letter, not an email. A handwritten letter on personal stationery, the kind of correspondence that cost something, that said by its very medium that the writer understood the weight of what they were saying. She wrote for a long time. She crossed things out and started again. She did not try to explain herself, because explanation was the refuge of people who wanted absolution without the work of earning it. She did not make promises about the future that she could not be certain of keeping. She did not ask for forgiveness, because forgiveness was Madeline's to give or withhold on her own timeline. She wrote what she knew. She had been wrong. She had said things to Madeline that she should not have said. She had made decisions that had cost Madeline things that could not be returned. She had looked at a woman who was carrying her grandchildren and called her nothing, and she would spend the rest of her life understanding what that meant. She wrote that the children, should they ever want to know their grandmother, would be welcome to that relationship unconditionally and on their mother's terms. She wrote that she understood if the letter was never answered. She sealed it. She sent it to David Lim's office, because that was the only address she had, with a note asking him to pass it on at his discretion. She did not know if it would reach Madeline. She did not know if it would make any difference. But she understood, in the particular way that 71 years of living eventually teaches you, if you are paying attention, that some things had to be said regardless of whether they would be received, because not saying them was its own kind of failure. Julian received Eleanor's letter the same week, a separate letter, longer and more painful, the letter of a mother acknowledging to her son that she had steered him wrong and that she was going to have to live with the consequences of that. He read it twice and then folded it carefully and put it in his desk. He did not call her immediately. He needed a few days. He had been doing a great deal of thinking of his own in the week since March 15th. He had been thinking about who he was and who he had allowed himself to become, and whether those two things were the same and what the distance between them said about the choices he had made. He had also been thinking about Vivian. Vivian had not spoken to him since the wedding. She had sent a single text message 4 days after that said, "Archer and Celeste are fine, I need time. Please don't contact me." He had respected that. He had sent a separate message to Vivian's father. "I know I owe your daughter an explanation and an apology. Whenever she's ready, I'm here." Robert Blake had not responded. Julian had not expected him to. He was spending time with Archer and Celeste when Vivian allowed it, which was limited to twice-weekly visits of a few hours each, supervised at Vivian's apartment with Tess present as a buffer. The visits were strange and painful, and also in the specific way of small children who do not know anything about the complicated adult world they have been born into. Simple and immediate and surprisingly clarifying. Archer, at 3 months, had Julian's nose and Vivian's eyes, and a personality that was already asserting itself in the forms of strong opinions about feeding schedules and temperature and who was holding him. Celeste was quieter. She watched everything with the alert, unhurried attention of a baby who is collecting information and has not decided what to do with it yet. He sat with them and held them and felt the same thing he had heard in his own voice on the phone with Madeline, when he had asked if they were healthy. Love was a strange thing. It did not require that you be a good person to be capable of it. It did not wait until you had sorted yourself out. It arrived when it arrived, and you were simply in it. He held Archer and thought about 2 boys and 2 girls in Sydney who also had his nose or his eyes or his particular way of asserting those, and who would grow up knowing almost nothing about him for years. He had agreed to Madeline's terms. He had signed the legal documents David Lim had prepared. Child support payments that reflected his actual income, filed and documented in both jurisdictions, legal recognition of paternity. A formal agreement about contact, structured and limited, requiring Madeline's explicit consent for each interaction, which he understood and which he had signed without asking her to change a single term. He had also done one more thing, something he had not told anyone. Not Carter, not his lawyers, not his mother. He had established a trust for the 4 children. Separate from the child support. Significant. The kind of financial provision that said, "I understand I cannot buy my way into your lives, but I can make sure that money is never a constraint on your futures." He had asked David Lim to inform Madeline of the trust and to make clear that it came with no conditions and no expectations. David had relayed the message. Madeline had not responded yet. He had not expected an immediate response. He was learning, in the specific school that consequences provide, how to wait. May arrived. The Sydney autumn settled in around Madeline's apartment with the particular quality of Australian autumns, not the dramatic color change of American falls, but a softening, a shift in the quality of light, cooler mornings and evenings that arrived a little earlier. The babies were 4 months old. They had personalities now, distinct and unmistakable. The smallest girl, who Madeline had named Clara, had the most hair and the most opinions and the loudest voice and the most determined grip. The larger boy, Oliver, had the most serious expression and the most thorough way of examining objects, turning them in his hands with the focused attention of someone building a database. The smaller boy, Henry, laughed the most, a specific delighted sound that produced an involuntary answering laugh in every adult who heard it. The larger girl, Nora, was the quieter watcher, the one whose eyes followed everything, who seemed to be drawing conclusions. Madeline knew them. This was the thing she had not expected, the depth of knowing. Not just love, but specific individual, particular knowledge of 4 specific human beings who had arrived in the world with their own natures already present. She sat on the floor with all 4 of them on a Tuesday morning in May, the kind of morning when the light was exactly right, and the apartment was warm, and the company she was building was growing, and the foundation was taking shape. And David Lim had just emailed to confirm that Julian's trust documentation was complete and legally established, and she thought about the word Eleanor had used. Nothing. She looked at Clara, who was practicing a new sound that seemed to be the building block of a word. She looked at Oliver, who was engaged in the very serious business of trying to understand his own foot. She looked at Henry, who laughed for no reason and then looked pleased with himself. She looked at Nora, who was watching Madeline watch the others with the specific expression of a person who notices nothing. She almost laughed. She had given this family 4 hearts beating in the world. 4 lives being shaped by her care, by her choices, by the very particular way she loved. 4 futures that would go places she couldn't predict, that would do things she couldn't imagine, that would carry something of her forward into time in the most literal and permanent way possible. Nothing. She picked up Clara, who immediately grabbed a fistful of her hair with the confidence of someone who has no concept that this is inconvenient, and Madeline laughed and tried to gently extract her hair from Clara's grip, and Clara held on with absolute certainty that she was correct to do so. "You are a force of nature," Madeline told her. Clara responded with the sound that was becoming a word. Outside, the city went about its business. The harbor was there, somewhere beyond the buildings, the way it was always there, the water that had been there before any of them and would be there long after. The morning was moving forward the way mornings did, indifferent and consistent and full of possibility for anyone willing to show up in it. Madeline's phone buzzed, a notification from the Reclaim inbox. A new inquiry. She glanced at it. A woman in Melbourne, 53 years old, recently divorced after 28 years. Looking for help redesigning her home. The message was long and honest and a little raw, the way messages from women who have found something that feels safe tend to be. Madeline read it with Clara still in her arms, the familiar weight of her, the warmth of her. She thought about the woman in Melbourne who was 53 and starting over and needed her space to feel like hers. She thought about all the women she had not yet reached. She passed Clara to the playmat and picked up her laptop. She began to type. The letter Eleanor had sent arrived through David Lim's office on a Friday in May, almost 2 months after it had been written. David had held it, as requested, until the timing felt right, which was a judgment call Madeline had trusted him to make, and which he had made with the careful consideration of a lawyer who understands that some things are about more than law. Madeline sat with the sealed envelope for almost an hour before she opened it. She made tea. She settled the babies. She sat at her kitchen table in the May afternoon with the envelope in front of her and thought about what it might contain and what she would do with whatever it contained. Then she opened it. She read it. She read it again. Eleanor's handwriting was what she had expected, precise, controlled. Each letter formed with the care of a woman who had been taught that handwriting was a reflection of character and had never stopped believing it. The words were not what she had expected. They were simpler. They were honest in a way that Eleanor Whitmore, in Madeline's 7 years of knowing her, had never been honest, the kind of honest that costs something, that requires you to set down the story you have been telling yourself and hold up instead the story that is actually true. Madeline read the letter a 3rd time. She thought about forgiveness. Not whether Eleanor deserved it. That was the wrong question, and she knew it was the wrong question. Forgiveness was not a reward for deserving. Forgiveness was a thing you did for yourself when you were ready, when carrying the weight of not forgiving had become more expensive than releasing it. She was not ready yet, but she was closer than she had been in March. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer of her desk where she kept the things she was not done with yet. Then she went back to the woman in Melbourne who was 53 and starting over. She had work to do. The Melbourne woman's name was Patricia Holt. 53 years old, 28 years of marriage, to a man who had spent the last decade of it making her feel like furniture. Present and functional and entirely unremarkable. She had 2 grown children who lived interstate and called on birthdays and meant well and were not equipped to handle the specific grief of watching your mother start over from the beginning at an age when most people were thinking about slowing down. She had found Reclaim through Sandra Park's profile. She had read the article 3 times before she wrote the email, which Madeline knew because Patricia told her so at the beginning of their first call, with the particular honesty of a woman who has decided that if she is going to do this terrifying thing, she is going to do it without pretending she is not terrified. "I read what you said," Patricia told her, "about spending 7 years in a house that was beautiful but never felt like yours. I've spent 28 years in a house that was mine and never felt beautiful. I don't know if that's the same thing. It might be the opposite of the same thing," Madeline said. "Which means it might be the same wound from a different direction." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, that's exactly what it is. They worked together for 6 weeks. Madeline and one of her designers, a young woman named Iris, who had joined Reclaim 3 months ago and who had the specific gift of translating what women said they wanted into what they actually meant, flew to Melbourne twice. They walked through Patricia's house, which was a large Federation-style home in Kew that had been furnished. Patricia explained primarily by her ex-husband's mother, who had strong opinions about the correct way a house in that neighborhood should look. "What do you actually like?" Iris asked at the first walkthrough. "Not what looks right. Not what makes sense. What do you actually like?" Patricia had stood in her own living room and looked around it like someone trying to remember a language they had not spoken in decades. "Color," she said finally. "I like color. He always said it was overwhelming." "He's not here," Iris said. Something shifted in Patricia's face. "No," she said. "He's not." By the time the project was complete, Patricia Holt's house in Kew was full of color, deep terracotta and warm gold and the specific green of eucalyptus leaves, colors that were distinctly Australian and distinctly hers, that said this house belongs to someone who has opinions and is not apologizing for them. Patricia cried when she walked through it for the first time after the redesign. "Not from sadness, from recognition. That's me," she said. "That's actually me." Madeline had heard variations of that sentence from every client she had worked with. It never got smaller, it never became ordinary. Every time she heard it, she felt the same thing, the specific quiet satisfaction of work that matters, work that does something real in the world. She flew back to Sydney on a Thursday evening and walked into her apartment and was met at the door by Priya, who was babysitting and who had a look on her face that Madeline read immediately as news. "What happened?" Madeline asked. "Nothing bad," Priya said. "A phone call, a producer from a morning program into Sydney, which you already knew about. But also," she paused in the way she paused when she was deciding how to frame something. "A call from a woman named Catherine Webb." The name meant nothing to Madeline. "She's the head of programming at a production company that makes documentary series," Priya said. "She saw Sandra's profile. She wants to make a documentary series about Reclaim. About the company and the women it works with." Another pause. "About you," Madeline set down her bag. "About me, about your story," Priya said. She was very clear that she's not interested in the tabloid version. She said she wants to make something about what it looks like when a woman decides she's done being underestimated. Madeline was quiet for a moment. She could hear the babies through the monitor, the specific sounds of 4 people who were not quite awake and not quite asleep, the small shufflings and murmurings of them. "Tell her I'll think about it," Madeline said. "She's going to push for a meeting, I know. Tell her I'll think about it." She went into the baby's room and stood in the doorway and looked at them in the dim light and thought about what it meant to tell your own story versus listening other people tell it. The tabloid version had already been told. It had been told without her participation and largely without her consent, the broad strokes accurate enough but stripped of everything that gave it meaning, the interiority and the deliberateness, and the fact that none of it had been accidental. She thought about what she would want her children to know about this chapter of their lives when they were old enough to understand it. She thought about all the women who were going to go through versions of what she had gone through, who were sitting right now in houses that did not feel like theirs, in marriages that were telling them they were nothing, in the middle of making decisions they were not sure they could survive. She thought about what it would mean to those women to see the full story. Not the headline, the story. She went to bed without having decided. She woke up at 5:43, which was the hour she had been waking up since before the babies were born, her internal clock having apparently decided this was the hour of clarity and reckoning and was not prepared to negotiate. She lay in the dark and thought about it for exactly 42 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and texted Priya, set up the meeting with Catherine Webb. The summer arrived in Sydney, which meant December, which meant the city was bright and hot and full of the particular energy of a place that celebrates the end of the year in the middle of the warmest season, which always struck Madeline as the correct way to do it. The end of something and the brightest possible light at the same time. The babies turned 11 months old. They were not quite walking yet, though Clara was making a very serious attempt that involved pulling herself up on every available surface, and then standing very still with the expression of someone who has committed to a course of action and is now reconsidering, and then sitting down abruptly, and then getting up and trying again with undiminished determination. She was the most like her mother, Priya said, and Madeline was not entirely sure whether that was a compliment or a warning. Reclaim had grown 7 full-time staff, a waiting list of clients that extended 3 months out. The foundation, officially incorporated as the Reclaim Foundation for Women in Transition, had completed its first 3 pro bono projects who had come through a domestic violence support organization that Madeline had partnered with in October. All 3 women had been referred by social workers, who had initially been skeptical that interior design was relevant to what their client had needed, and who had been quietly, substantially changed in their understanding by what they saw. One of the social workers, a man named Marcus, who had worked in the sector for 12 years, had called Madeline after the 3rd project was complete. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When the referral came through, I thought it was a luxury service dressed up as social welfare." "It's a fair thing to have thought," Madeline said. "It's not what it is," he said. "I watched a woman walk into a room that we redesigned for her, and I watched her stand in it, and I watched her face change. Something happened that I don't have a clinical word for." "Recognition," Madeline said. "Yes," he said. "That's it. She recognized herself in it. That's the whole thing," Madeline said. "That's all we're doing. Giving women back their own reflection." The documentary meeting with Catherine Webb had happened in October and had gone well in the specific way of meetings where 2 people discover quickly that they are interested in the same thing for the same reasons. Catherine was 47, direct, and had made 3 previous documentary series about women who had done remarkable things in unremarkable ways, which was how she described her subject matter. She was not interested in heroic narratives or redemptive arcs engineered for maximum emotional impact. "I want to make something true," she said. "Messy where it's messy. Quiet where it's quiet. I don't want a story about a woman who triumphed over adversity. I want a story about a woman who kept making decisions, one at a time, until she had built something she wanted to live in." Madeline had looked at her across the table for a moment. "The children's faces are not filmed," she said. "Their names are at my discretion. Any footage involving them requires my sign-off at every stage." "Agreed," Catherine said without hesitation. "The Whitmore family is not contacted for comment. This is not a story about them." "Agreed. And I retain the right to review any segment that discusses my medical history or the circumstances of the divorce before it airs." "That's standard," Catherine said. Agreed. They had shaken hands. The filming had begun in November. It was strange at first having a camera present. Not intrusive in the way she had feared, Catherine ran a disciplined and considerate crew, but strange in the way of being seen, really seen, in the ordinary moments of your own life. Madeline at her desk in the early morning before the babies woke. Madeline in client meetings, which required separate consent from each client, all of whom agreed when they understood what the series was. Madeline walking through a finished project with a woman who was about to see her redesigned space for the first time. The camera was there for Patricia Holt's walkthrough when Patricia had stood in her terracotta living room and said, "That's actually me." Catherine, watching the footage later, had said to Madeline that 30 seconds is the whole series. Everything else is the explanation of that 30 seconds. It was December when Julian called, not to negotiate, not through lawyers, not about the children's legal status, which had been settled comprehensively and formally 4 months ago. He called on a Sunday afternoon, which Madeline knew from the timestamp because she almost didn't answer. And when she did answer, there was a pause before he spoke that told her he has been sitting with the phone in his hands for a while before he pressed the button. "I saw the piece in the magazine," he said, "the longer one. The follow-up to Sandra's profile. There had been a follow-up piece in October, a longer conversation with a different journalist, more substantive, less focused on the personal narrative, and more on the business and the foundation." "I read it," he said. Madeline waited. "I wanted to say that what you've built is—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't have the right word for it. It's significant, it's real, and I wanted you to know that I see it." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said, a pause. "How are they?" he asked. She knew who he meant. Clara pulled herself up yesterday and stood for about 4 seconds before she said. She was furious about it. "Oliver has discovered that if he makes a certain sound, everyone in the room turns to look at him, and he is using this information strategically." Henry laughed so hard at Priya on Thursday that he fell over. Nora has been observing all of this with what I can only describe as academic interest. Julian was quiet on the other end for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was slightly rough. "They sound like real people," he said. "They are entirely real people," Madeline said. "They have been real people since January." "I know." Another pause. "I'm going to be in Sydney in February," he said. "A business conference." I'm not asking for anything. I'm not going to show up and create a situation. I just wanted you to know in case you wanted to," he stopped. "In case you wanted to decide what you wanted to do with that information." Madeline sat with that for a moment. She thought about the legal agreement, the formal, documented, carefully structured terms she had set and he had signed. The agreement that specified that contact required her explicit consent. She thought about 4 children who would grow up and ask questions. She thought about the difference between punishment and protection. She had not built the legal structure to punish Julian. She had built it to protect her children. The question was whether, 11 months in, with the legal framework solid and her life built, and her own ground under her feet in a way it had never been during the 7 years of their marriage, the protection still required the same walls. "Send the dates to David," she said. "I'll think about it," she heard him exhale. "Thank you," he said. "I haven't agreed to anything," she said. "I know," he said. "Thank you anyway." She ended the call. She sat for a moment. Then she went into the room where 4 almost 1-year-old people were engaged in various enterprises of discovery, and she sat down on the floor among them, and Clara immediately attempted to use her as a standing surface, and Oliver turned his strategic sound in her direction, and Henry laughed for no reason, and Nora looked at her with those watchful eyes that missed nothing. "I'm figuring it out," she told them. Clara grabbed her hair. "Yes," Madeline said, "I know, you're right. The first birthday party was Priya's idea," which meant it happened with the particular organized enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for an occasion worthy of her full logistical capabilities. January 19th, 1 year, the apartment was too small, so they used a community space 2 blocks away that Priya had booked 6 weeks in advance. The guest list was small, intentionally, the people who had been part of this year in real ways, not an event but a gathering, the difference being interior rather than logistical. Dr. Osi came, which touched Madeline more than she expected. The doctor who had said all 4 of them look healthy, being present to see them a year later. Healthy and real and emphatically present. Marcus from the domestic violence organization came with his wife. Sandra Park was there, Catherine Webb and 1 member of her crew, with camera, because Madeline had decided that this was part of the story, and the story deserved to be told honestly. Grace, the retired school teacher from the Melbourne flight, was there because Madeline had tracked her down 3 months after landing in Sydney, and they had become, in the particular way of women who meet at significant moments and recognize each other, genuinely close. "You told me good for you on a plane," Madeline had told her when she called. "That mattered more than you know." "I could see you were doing something hard," Grace had said simply. Anyone could have said it. "No," Madeline had said. "They couldn't have. But you did. The party was everything a first birthday party should be. Which is to say, it was loud and slightly chaotic and full of people who loved the birthday children, finding every excuse to hold them, and all 4 babies handled it with their characteristic approaches. Clara with determined participation, Oliver with strategic assessment, Henry with uncomplicated delight, and Nora by sitting very still in the middle of everything, and watching it all happen around her with the expression of a person who is storing this for later. Madeline stood at the edge of the room and watched it. She thought about January 19th of the previous year. The hospital, the 4 heartbeats she had been listening to for months, suddenly in the world, suddenly with faces, suddenly with weight and warmth and the specific reality of people who have arrived and intend to stay. She thought about the airport in Chicago, the security line, the decision not to look back. She thought about Eleanor's letter in the drawer of her desk, which she had read 6 times and had not answered yet, and which she was not ready to answer yet but was less far from than she had been. She thought about Julian sending the conference dates to David Lim's email and what she was going to decide about that, and the fact that she had not decided yet and was allowing herself not to decide yet because she had learned, in 12,000 miles and 12 months and 4 children and 1 company and 1 foundation, that some decisions required the time they required, and rushing them was its own kind of mistake. Priya appeared beside her with 2 glasses of champagne and handed her one. "How does it feel?" Priya asked. "Real," Madeline said. "It feels real, good real or overwhelming real." Madeline looked at the room. At Nora watching everything, at Henry laughing, at Oliver plotting. At Clara, who had pulled herself upright on the edge of a chair and was standing with her characteristic 4-second and then, as Madeline watched, did not sit down, took a step. 1 step, then another. Then she sat down hard with the expression of someone who has done something extraordinary and knows it. Every person in the room who was watching erupted. Clara looked around at all of them, and then she laughed. The specific, delighted, surprised laugh of a person who has discovered that the world responds to what you do in it. Madeline's eyes filled. She did not bother to stop them. That reel, she said, the documentary series titled Reclaim, premiered in March, 14 months after the wedding that never happened, 13 months after Madeline in a City C apartment with 1 suitcase and 4 heartbeats and a plan. It aired on a streaming platform in Australia, then was picked up within a week for international distribution, which Catherine said was the fastest she had seen a documentary travel in her 20 years of making them. Madeline watched the first episode alone after the babies were asleep, with a glass of tea and the monitor on the couch beside her. She watched herself at her desk in the early morning light. She watched herself in the first client meeting, asking the woman across from her to tell me what you actually want, not what it's supposed to look like. She watched the footage from Patricia Holt's house, the moment of recognition. That's actually me. And she watched her own face in the background of that shot, the expression on it, and understood for the first time from the outside what it looked like when she was doing the thing she was supposed to be doing. She looked like herself. She looked specifically like a woman who had found her place in the world and was standing in it without apology. She texted Priya at 11:45 at night. "It's good," she wrote. Priya wrote back immediately, because Priya was always awake at 11:45. "It's extraordinary," Priya wrote. "Like you," Madeline set the phone down. She sat in the quiet of the apartment with the monitor beside her, broadcasting the small sounds of 4 sleeping children, and thought about the past 14 months. She thought about everything she had lost and everything she had built, and whether those 2 things were connected in the way she had come to believe they were, whether the building had required the losing, whether she would have found her way to this life, this real and full and entirely hers life, without the specific pain of being called nothing by a woman who had not understood what she was looking at. She did not know the answer. She was not sure it mattered. What mattered was what was real. 4 children sleeping in the next room. A company with 7 staff and a waiting list. A foundation that had given 3 women their own reflections back. A documentary that was already, in its first week, generating the kind of response that meant it had found the nerve it was looking for. The specific nerve of women who recognized themselves in it. A drawer with a letter she was almost ready to answer. A conference in February that she had decided 3 days ago to allow not a family introduction, not a reconciliation. A brief, structured, documented meeting in a neutral location with David Lim present, in which 4 children would be in the same room as their biological father for the first time, and what happened after that would be determined by what happened there, by how he was and who they were and what the future, in its own time, decided to build. She had not told Julian this yet. She was going to tell him tomorrow. She picked up her tea. She looked at the monitor, the small dark shapes of 4 people who had been with her through everything without knowing they were with her, who had been the reason for every decision she had made in the past 14 months, who were going to grow up and ask hard questions and deserve honest answers, and receive them, because she had decided from the beginning that honesty was the only foundation worth building on. She thought about the word nothing. She thought about Eleanor's precise handwriting. She thought about the phrase she had read in the letter that she had not been able to stop thinking about since, the phrase that had surprised her more than anything else, more than the apology, more than the acknowledgement. A single line near the end: "I have spent the past months trying to understand what I was actually afraid of when I looked at you. I think I was afraid of how clearly you saw things." Madeline had read that line 6 times. She had thought about it every few days since. She was still thinking about it. The February meeting happened on a Tuesday morning. Julian arrived early, which told Madeline something. She had been watching the door from inside the cafe they had chosen, a neutral, public, unremarkable place in a neighborhood that meant nothing to anyone, and Julian had arrived 7 minutes before the agreed time and was standing on the pavement when she arrived with a double stroller and Priya beside her. He saw them from the street. Madeline watched his face from a distance before he knew she was watching. She saw him see the stroller. She saw what happened to him. Not a performance, not the managed emotion of a man who has prepared how he wants to appear. Something real and unmanaged and entirely human, the face of a man encountering a consequence that has become 4 small real people, and the encounter costing him exactly as much as it should. He had earned that cost. She had decided she was not going to soften it, but she also was not going to be cruel. She walked toward him. He looked at her first, Madeline, Julian, then he looked at the stroller. David Lim was there. Priya was there. The terms were clear and had been discussed in advance. This was 30 minutes, supervised, no photographs. No social media, no follow-up contact except through David. 30 minutes. Julian crouched down in front of the stroller. 4 faces looked at him with the various degrees of interest and assessment that characterized their personalities. Clara looked at him with her characteristic determination to form an opinion. Oliver watched him with his database expression. Henry offered his indiscriminate delight to this new person as he offered it to everyone. Nora watched from under her lashes. "Hello," Julian said. His voice was very quiet, very careful. Henry laughed. Julian made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was the most honest thing Madeline had ever heard come out of him. He stayed crouched there for a moment, just looking at them, and Madeline stood behind the stroller and let him, because whatever else was true, they were his children too. And the moment of encountering that reality deserved to be what it was. After 30 minutes, they said goodbye. Julian stood up. He looked at Madeline. There were things in his face that she recognized from 9 years of knowing him, and things that were new. The particular lines of a year of reckoning, the specific way a person looks when they have been changed by something they couldn't control. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank David. He made it possible." Julian looked at her for a moment. "How did you do it?" he asked. "All of it. How did you do all of it?" She thought about it. She thought about the airport, the plane, the apartment, the 4 heartbeats on the monitor, the sleepless nights and the work and Priya and Dr. Osi and Patricia Holt saying, "That's actually me," and Clara taking her first step, and the documentary and the foundation, and the drawer with Eleanor's letter and the morning light through the windows of a city that had been entirely new to her and was now entirely hers. "I decided," she said. "Every single day I decided to keep going." Julian nodded. He looked at the stroller one more time. He left. Madeline stood on the pavement, with Priya beside her and 4 children in the stroller, and the February morning moving forward around them. "Okay," Priya said. "Yes," Madeline said. She meant it completely. She answered Eleanor's letter that afternoon. She did not write it to be kind, though it was not unkind. She wrote it to be honest, because honesty was the only language she had trusted for the past 14 months, the only currency that held its value. She wrote that she had received the letter, that she had read it many times, that she did not yet know what the future held in terms of a relationship between Eleanor and her grandchildren, but that she was not closing that door, and that the door being open was contingent on understanding that the children's lives were Madeline's to govern, and that entering those lives was a privilege that had to be earned through sustained, consistent, demonstrated respect. She wrote one more thing. She wrote, "You said you were afraid of how clearly I saw things. I want you to know that what I saw in that kitchen was not an enemy. I saw a woman who had spent her whole life protecting her family the only way she knew how, and who had not yet learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a family is decide who is worthy of belonging to it." She sealed the letter. She sent it. Then she went back to work. The months that followed wrote themselves the way months do when you are fully inside your own life, quickly and with the specific richness of days that are not being held at a distance. Reclaim took on its 8th employee. The foundation completed 6 pro bono projects. The documentary was nominated for an industry award that Catherine said meant nothing in the Baltimore, but meant something to the people who made things like this. The babies turned 1 and then moved through their 2nd year, with the accelerating momentum of children who have discovered that the world is enormous and they intend to investigate all of it. Clara walked with the same determination with which she did everything. Oliver catalogued and assessed and occasionally offered conclusions in the form of single emphatic sounds. Henry laughed. Nora watched and increasingly spoke in full sentences that emerged from her watchful silence with the precision of someone who has been composing them for a while. Madeline built. That was the word she had for it. Not survived. Not recovered. Not moved on, which was the language of people who thought the past was something left behind rather than something you carried forward. Integrated and transformed into the material of who you were becoming. She built every day. She made decisions, small and large, the way she had always made decisions, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who understands that your life is the sum of the things you choose and not the things that happen to you. She was standing on the stage of a conference in Sydney, 2 years and 3 months after she had landed in this city with 1 suitcase and 4 heartbeats, when a woman in the front row asked her the question she had been asked in many forms over the past year, by journalists and clients and the women who wrote to her through the Reclaim website, and by Patricia Holt at a dinner last October, who had asked it most directly of anyone. The woman in the front row was 39 and had the specific expression of someone who is sitting in a room where something important is being said and is trying to decide whether to apply it to herself. "How did you know you were going to be okay?" she asked. The room was quiet. Madeline looked at her. She thought about the kitchen in Chicago and the folder on the table and the word nothing. She thought about the airport and the plane and the morning light in Sydney. She thought about 4 heartbeats and 8 months of building, and March 15th, the courier in a gray uniform in Julian's face. When he opened the envelope and the particular sound he had made, when he crouched in front of a stroller on a February pavement and Henry laughed at him. She thought about Clara taking her first step. She thought about a letter in a drawer that she had finally answered. She thought about standing in her own life finally, after 35 years, in the particular way that you stand in something when it is entirely yours. "I didn't know," she said. "I decided." She let that sit for a moment. "There's a difference," she said. "Knowing you're going to be okay is a feeling. Deciding you're going to be okay is a choice. The feeling comes and goes. The choice holds." The woman in the front row looked at her. Madeline looked back. "Make the choice," she said. "Every day, even when you don't feel it." Especially when you don't feel it, she meant every word. She knew because she had lived it, every single day of it, in 12,000 miles of hard road and 4 impossible heartbeats, and 1 city that had been a stranger to her and was now home. Madeline Harper had been called nothing by a woman who did not understand what she was looking at. She had taken that word and she had turned it into a company, a foundation, 4 children, a documentary, a letter she had finally sent, a morning in February on a pavement in Sydney, a stage in a conference room, and a life so full and so entirely her own that the word nothing had ceased to mean anything at all. Not because she had proven Eleanor wrong, because she had proven herself right. And in the end, that was the only proof that had ever mattered.